Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity slows its breathing and ancient stories are told gently enough to rest beside. Tonight's journey drifts back to a time before kings, before temples, before humanity itself had hands to lift a tool. It begins not with mortals but with gods who grew tired. Not tired in the way we are after a long afternoon, but tired in a way that reshaped the structure of the world. This is the story of the Igigi, the younger gods of Mesopotamian tradition, the ones assigned the work no one else wished to do. They are often mentioned only briefly in surviving tablets, appearing at the edges of greater names like Anu, Enlil, and Enki. Yet without them, the human story may never have begun. Their rebellion is not framed as a cosmic battle of good and evil. It is quieter than that, and far more consequential. It is dispute over labour, hierarchy, exhaustion, and the limits of obedience. If you find this exploration soothing or quietly intriguing, consider offering a like or subscribing. It helps this calm corner of our ancient history continue reaching those who enjoy wandering through the older layers of memory. Now, settle in. Let the pace slow. The Igigi are rarely given centre stage, but their presence hums beneath some of the oldest myths ever pressed into clay. In the beginning of the Mesopotamian cosmos, the universe was not empty. It was structured, layered, and governed. At the highest level stood Anu, Lord of the Heavens. Beneath him ruled Enlil, who commanded the air and authority. Enki governed the waters and wisdom. Together with other great deities, they formed what is often called the Anunnaki, the senior gods. They decided, they decreed, they measured, and they assigned. Below them existed another class of divine beings. These were the Igigi. They were not human. They were not mortal. They were divine in nature, yet subordinate in rank. In the earliest accounts, especially in the Akkadian epic often referred to as the Atrahasis narrative, the Igigi are described as labourers. Their work was not symbolic, it was physical. The cosmos, according to these myths, required maintenance. Rivers had to be dug, irrigation channels carved, earth shaped and ordered. Even the divine realm demanded infrastructure. The Anunnaki, high in status and authority, did not perform this labour themselves. It was assigned downward. For a time the arrangement held. The Igigi worked. They carried baskets of soil. They dug canals. They maintained the boundaries between waters and land. They upheld the architecture of the world itself. The texts describe this labour as heavy and prolonged. The number 40 appears in some versions of the story, marking decades of effort. Immortality did not shield them from fatigue. Divine nature did not remove the burden of repetition. It is important to understand that in Mesopotamian thought, work was not inherently noble. Labour was necessity. Kings boasted of building canals and temples, but the physical act of digging earth was rarely romanticised. In this mythic framework, even gods could resent it. As years passed, dissatisfaction among the Igigi deepened. The tablets suggest murmuring, complaint, weariness that did not fade. The hierarchy of heaven began to strain under the weight of its own expectations. One night, the breaking point arrived. The Igigi did not simply abandon their tasks. They gathered, they organised, they burned their tools in a gesture that was both practical and symbolic. Fire consumed the implements of their servitude. Then they marched. Their destination was the dwelling of Enlil, the chief administrator among the Anunnaki, the god who issued commands, the overseer of order. The Igigi surrounded his residence. The imagery is striking. Lesser gods, once compliant, now standing in unified defiance at the gates of authority. Inside, the senior gods were unsettled. The noise of the uprising reached them. The Atrahasis epic describes fear among the Anunnaki, not fear of physical defeat alone, but fear of disorder. The cosmos functioned on hierarchy. If the structure fractured, what would hold the layers together? Enlil demanded to know the instigator. He sought a leader to punish. The Igigi answered collectively. There was no single rebel. The burden had been shared, and so was the refusal. This moment stands as one of the earliest recorded labour strikes in human storytelling. It is not framed in modern political terms, yet the pattern is recognisable. Workers overextended, authority challenged, a system forced to adapt or collapse. The senior gods deliberated. Anu listened. Enlil fumed. The tablets describe tension among them. To punish the Igigi entirely would remove the workforce sustaining the world. To concede entirely would undermine divine hierarchy. Enki, often portrayed as thoughtful and inventive, offered an alternative. If the Igigi would no longer perform the labour, another being could be fashioned to take their place. Here the myth turns toward one of its most consequential developments. The creation of humanity is not described as a spontaneous act of generosity. It emerges as a solution to a labour crisis. The Igigi's rebellion becomes the catalyst. Enki proposed shaping a new species from clay, mixed with the essence of a sacrificed deity. In some versions, the god chosen for sacrifice is described as possessing intelligence or rebellious spirit. His blood would mingle with earth. From this combination would arise humans, capable of toil. The Anunnaki agreed. The Igigi watched. Clay was gathered, ritual words spoken, the divine spark introduced. The first humans were formed not to rule, not to contemplate, but to work, to dig canals, to maintain fields, to bear the physical burden once carried by divine hands. The rebellion succeeded, though not in the way modern narratives might frame success. The Igigi did not overthrow the Anunnaki. They did not assume control. They secured relief from labour. Humanity inherited the task. In this transfer lies a subtle shift in cosmic order. The gods no longer bore the weight of infrastructure. Humans entered the equation as intermediaries between earth and heaven. The Igigi fade from central focus after this point in many texts. Their purpose, in the narrative sense, had been fulfilled. Yet their story lingers beneath subsequent mythologies. Some later traditions blur distinctions between classes of divine beings. The term Igigi occasionally becomes interchangeable with Anunnaki in certain texts. Memory compresses, roles merge. But in the older layers, the separation is clear. Younger gods, assigned labour, collective refusal. What makes this narrative particularly compelling is its tone. The tablets do not describe the Igigi as evil. They are not cast as demonic. Their exhaustion is acknowledged. Their grievance is understood. The solution is negotiated, not annihilated. This stands in contrast to later myths from other cultures, where rebellious divine beings are cast down permanently. Here, the rebellion results in structural adjustment rather than eternal condemnation. There is also something revealing about the logic behind humanity's origin in this account. Humans are not accidental. They are not the centerpiece of cosmic affection. They are necessary, functional, created to sustain order where divine patience ended. Yet over time, humans develop their own narratives, their own cities, their own gods within gods. The original reason for their creation becomes layered with meaning. Sacrifice and worship enter the exchange. Humans feed the gods with offerings. In return, the gods maintain stability. The Igigi's refusal remains embedded at the root. As centuries passed, scribes copied and recopied these stories onto clay tablets. Each retelling preserved fragments. Some details shifted, others remained stable. The Atrahasis epic, discovered in pieces across Mesopotamian sites, offers one of the clearest accounts. It situates the rebellion early, before flood narratives and later divine human conflicts. Reading these lines thousands of years later, one senses not chaos but negotiation. The cosmos is administrative. Decisions are made through council. Solutions are practical. Even the act of sacrificing a god to create humanity is presented with procedural calm. Blood mixed with clay, forms shaped, purpose assigned. The Igigi step back from the foreground. Their work complete in another sense. their rebellion resolved not through destruction, but redistribution. From this point forward, the burden of maintaining irrigation canals, of tilling soil under Mesopotamian sun, of constructing temple platforms, belongs to humanity. Kings would later frame such labour as sacred duty, but in the deep mythic memory it began as a substitution. There is no triumphant speech marking the Igigi's release, no grand farewell, they simply cease to dig. And so the stage shifts. The world that follows is one where humans multiply, where noise rises, where Enlil, at a later point in the Atrahasis narrative, grows disturbed by human clamour. Flood becomes a proposed solution to a new problem, another crisis born from adaptation. The pattern is cyclical. Labour leads to dissatisfaction. Creation leads to noise. Authority responds. But before flood, before cities swell and kings inscribe their victories, there was that earlier night, tools cast into flame, a march toward the residence of command. The Igigi do not vanish entirely from the textual record. Their name persists in lists of deities. In some hymns, they appear as part of the heavenly assembly. In others, they stand as a collective host of gods. The sharp edge of rebellion softens over time. Memory does that. It rounds the corners of conflict. Yet when we return to the older tablets, pressed with cuneiform marks by careful hands, we encounter them at the moment of refusal, tired, united, standing before the gate. It is there that this story truly begins to widen, because to understand why the Igigi were assigned labour at all, and how the hierarchy between Anunnaki and Igigi first formed, we must step further back into the earliest ordering of the Mesopotamian cosmos, to a time before rebellion, when authority was established and roles were first divided. Before the Igigi gathered in the dark with their tools laid down and their patience exhausted, there was an order that felt immovable. The universe, as imagined in the earliest Mesopotamian traditions, was not chaotic in its daily operation. It was structured, layered, and governed with intention. At the top of that structure stood the Anunnaki, the senior gods whose authority shaped heaven and earth long before any hint of rebellion stirred beneath them. In the Sumerian and later Akkadian texts, the cosmos begins with separation. Heaven and earth, once joined, are pulled apart. Anu takes the heights. Enlil claims the space between. Enki settles into the deep, sweet waters beneath the land. Around them gather other great deities, each with defined domains. The sky, the winds, the subterranean waters, fertility, storms, and order itself are not abstract forces, but assigned responsibilities. Authority in this worldview is administrative as much as divine. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as idle. They deliberate, decree, assign, and judge. Their power lies in coordination. In several myths they sit in assembly. Decisions are not always unilateral. There is discussion. There is rank. There is acknowledgement of hierarchy. Anu's position is supreme in the heavens, but Enlil governs practical order on earth. Enki offers counsel that is often clever, sometimes disruptive to the stricter impulses of his peers. The world they rule is still new in many of these accounts. Rivers must be directed, boundaries established, celestial cycles maintained. Mesopotamian culture developed in a landscape where irrigation determined survival. The Tigris and Euphrates could nourish or destroy depending on how well they were managed. It is not surprising that the divine realm mirrored this need for oversight. The gods are engineers as much as sovereigns. The term Anunnaki itself likely derives from Sumerian roots, meaning something like offspring of Anu or princely seed. They are elite by origin. Their authority is inherited and reinforced by position. In later texts, the term can refer to a broader assembly of deities, but in the earliest narrative layers relevant to the Igigi story, it marks those at the top of the divine structure. There is a tendency in modern retellings to dramatize ancient pantheons as unstable or constantly at war. The Mesopotamian material, especially in the context of the Atrahasis narrative, does not emphasize divine civil war at the outset. Instead, it presents a system that functions. The Anunnaki allocate tasks. The cosmos operates. The Earth itself in these myths is not yet populated by humanity. It exists as terrain under construction. Canals are conceptualized as divine projects before they are human ones. Fields are prepared in the divine imagination before mortals ever plant grain. The early period of rule by the Anunnaki is defined by infrastructure. To maintain that infrastructure, labour is required. It is here that the hierarchical nature of the divine order becomes most visible. The Anunnaki do not personally carry out every task. Authority delegates. Beneath them are the Igigi, the young gods whose role is not to deliberate in assembly, but to execute the physical demands of cosmic organization. This structure reflects something recognizable in ancient Mesopotamian society. Kings presided, priests mediated, laborers dug canals and built walls. The divine world mirrors the human one, or perhaps the human one mirrors the divine. In either case, hierarchy is not incidental, it is foundational. The Anunnaki's rule is also marked by ritual significance. Even in a pre-human world, sacred order matters. Offerings in later periods will sustain gods symbolically, but before offerings, there is maintenance. The rivers must flow properly, the land must be stable, the winds must circulate. These are not poetic abstractions in the tablets. They are practical necessities for a civilization that depended entirely on environmental balance. Enlil's role is especially central in this arrangement. Often depicted as stern and decisive, he is the administrator of Earth's functioning. When decisions need enforcement, he enforces. When labour must be assigned, he assigns it. His authority is rarely questioned at first, it is assumed. Anu, distant in the heavens, embodies ultimate sovereignty. He is less frequently depicted intervening in day-to-day management. His power is foundational rather than operational. Enki, meanwhile, operates with a different temperament. Associated with wisdom and the waters beneath the earth, he approaches problems with ingenuity. His solutions often involve creation rather than punishment. Within this triad, the Anunnaki maintain equilibrium. The Igigi's labour, though central to later events, is initially presented as expected. Divine hierarchy presumes service. The younger gods are assigned to dig canals and carry baskets of earth. The repetitive nature of this work is emphasized in the Atrahasis account. It is not temporary, it extends over decades. The Anunnaki's perspective on this arrangement is not recorded in detail at the outset, but their response to the later rebellion suggests they considered the division natural. When the Igigi finally protest, the shock among the senior gods indicates they did not anticipate defiance. Authority assumed compliance. This assumption reflects a worldview where order is fragile yet enforced. The Mesopotamian cosmos is not inherently stable without governance. Floods, droughts, and chaos are ever-present possibilities. The Anunnaki's rule prevents collapse. Delegated labour supports that rule. It is important to note that in these myths the gods are anthropomorphic in their motivations but not in their limitations. They experience frustration and fear. They deliberate. Yet they also possess the capacity to reshape reality itself. When confronted with a problem, their solutions can involve creating new species. The world under the Anunnaki is therefore a managed project. It is neither anarchic nor idyllic. It requires effort. The Igigi provide that effort. The Anunnaki supervise. Over time, this supervision becomes strained. The text suggests the labour imposed on the Igigi is heavy. The phrase describing their work conveys physical burden. They carry baskets. They dig out riverbeds. The imagery is tactile. It aligns with the known tasks of human agricultural societies in southern Mesopotamia, where irrigation canals demanded constant upkeep. The divine narrative thus grounds cosmic events in familiar experiences. Anyone living in ancient Sumer would understand the exhaustion of canal work. Transposing that exhaustion onto gods elevates labour into mythic significance. Yet before exhaustion becomes defiance, the world functions as designed. The rivers flow, the land is shaped, the Anunnaki preside in assembly, the Igigi labour in fields and along waterways. This era of rule is also marked by the absence of humanity's noise. Later in the Atrahasis epic, Enlil grows disturbed by the clamour of humans multiplying. In the pre-human period, such disturbance does not exist. The world is quieter, structured solely by divine activity. The Anunnaki's governance extends beyond physical labour. They define boundaries between heaven, earth, and the underworld. They allocate domains among themselves. Certain texts list them as judges of the dead in later traditions. Their authority evolves across centuries of storytelling, but the core image remains: a council of powerful beings shaping and maintaining order. In temple inscriptions from later periods, kings often invoke the Anunnaki collectively as witnesses to oaths or guarantors of legitimacy. Their name carries weight. To swear by them is to anchor a promise in cosmic authority. This later reverence contrasts subtly with the earlier narrative in which their authority is challenged by those beneath them. It suggests that memory of the rebellion did not permanently tarnish their status. Instead, the event became one episode within a broader tapestry of divine governance. To understand the Igigi's eventual refusal, one must grasp the magnitude of the Anunnaki's position. They are not casual overseers. They embody the structure of the cosmos. Their decisions ripple through creation. When the Igigi surround Enlil's dwelling, they do not merely confront a supervisor. They confront the representative of cosmic order. That is why fear spreads among the senior gods. The challenge threatens more than pride. It threatens stability. Yet in this earlier phase, before tools are burned and gates encircled, stability holds. The Anunnaki rule unopposed. The younger gods fulfill their assignments. The cosmos is young but operational. There is no dramatic music in the background of these tablets. The tone is procedural. Tasks are assigned. Work is done. Authority is acknowledged. That procedural calm makes the later shift more significant. It reveals that rebellion is not born from chaos but from endurance. The longer a system operates without adaptation, the more pressure accumulates beneath its surface. The world ruled by the Anunnaki is efficient but unyielding. It does not initially consider renegotiation. Labour is simply part of existence. As decades pass within the mythic time frame, the weight of that labour grows heavier in narrative emphasis. The repetition of digging and carrying is highlighted. The phrase describing the Igigi's complaint underscores fatigue. The Anunnaki, in their elevated positions, do not share this fatigue. Their responsibilities differ. They deliberate and decree rather than excavate. This distinction between decision-making and execution defines the cosmos in its early stage. It is a vertical arrangement. Authority at the top, labour at the base. From this arrangement, the seeds of dissent begin to form, not immediately but inevitably. The system is stable, yet imbalance persists. The Igigi's work sustains the world, but their status does not rise with their contribution. In the quiet years before the rebellion, the Anunnaki continue to preside. They sit in council, they define boundaries, they maintain oversight. Below them, the younger gods dig canals that will one day feed human fields. They shape a landscape that will eventually host cities like Ur, Uruk and Lagash. The irony is subtle. The labour meant to sustain divine order prepares the ground for humanity's emergence. The Anunnaki's rule, firm and structured, sets the stage for everything that follows. Without their initial governance, there would be no organised cosmos to contest. Without their delegation of labour, there would be no grievance to voice. And so the world turns quietly under their supervision. Heaven remains high. Earth is carved and shaped. The waters are directed. The younger gods continue their assigned tasks. For now, authority holds. Yet beneath the steady rhythm of digging and carrying, beneath the unchallenged decrees of assembly, dissatisfaction gathers strength in silence. And the world that appears so firmly ruled begins to feel the faint tremor of change. Long before their tools were set ablaze and their footsteps echoed outside Enlil's dwelling, the Igigi existed as a defined class within the Mesopotamian divine order. They were not stray spirits or chaotic forces wandering at the edges of creation. They were named, counted, assigned. Their identity was embedded within the structure of heaven and earth, though always beneath the more frequently invoked Anunnaki. The word Igigi appears primarily in Akkadian texts, though its deeper linguistic roots remain debated. Some scholars suggest it refers broadly to the heavenly gods, while others emphasize its use in contexts that distinguish them from the senior divine assembly. In the Atrahasis epic, which provides the clearest narrative involving them, the distinction is explicit. The Igigi are the younger gods. The Anunnaki are the elder authorities. Rank is not implied, it is stated. In mythological lists, the divine world is often organized in tiers. At the summit stands Anu, lord of the sky. Beneath him are high deities such as Enlil and Enki. Surrounding them are other powerful figures with specific domains. Further down, the Igigi form a collective. Their number is not always consistent in surviving texts, but they are portrayed as numerous. They are a workforce. It is important to resist the temptation to imagine them as minor in power simply because they labour. In Mesopotamian cosmology, divinity is not erased by assignment. The Igigi are still gods. They are immortal. They possess awareness and agency. What differentiates them is function. The world they inhabit is not yet human. There are no cities, no kings, no temples filled with offerings. The canals and rivers that will later nourish agriculture are projects underway. The Igigi are responsible for digging these waterways. The work is not symbolic. The tablets describe baskets of soil carried on shoulders, earth cut and moved. The language conveys effort. In ancient southern Mesopotamia, irrigation was survival. Without managed canals, the land could not sustain crops. Flooding could be destructive. Drought could be fatal. The divine myth mirrors this environment. The Igigi perform the tasks that human labourers would later know intimately. The assignment of labour to the Igigi reflects the hierarchical worldview of early Mesopotamian society. Just as kings did not personally dig canals, the Anunnaki do not perform manual work. Authority issues commands. Subordinates execute them. There is no immediate resentment described at the beginning of their assignment. The texts imply that for a time, the arrangement is accepted. The Igigi dig. The rivers flow. Order is maintained. The hierarchy functions as designed. Yet even in this acceptance, one can observe imbalance. The Igigi sustain the physical framework of the cosmos. Their contribution is foundational. Without their labour, the world would remain unstructured terrain. The Anunnaki's governance depends on that structure. The distinction between the Igigi and the Anunnaki is therefore not about necessity. Both are necessary. It is about privilege. One group decides, the other carries out. Over decades within the mythic time frame, the physical burden accumulates. The Atrahasis text specifies a span of years, often rendered as 40, during which the Igigi toil continuously. The number carries symbolic weight in ancient literature, often marking a complete cycle or extended duration. Whether literal or symbolic, the message is clear. The labour is prolonged. The Igigi's immortality does not shield them from exhaustion. This detail is striking. One might assume that divine beings would not experience fatigue as humans do. Yet the narrative emphasises their weariness. Their bodies may not age, but their patience thins. The portrayal of the Igigi as labourers rather than warriors or tricksters gives their identity a grounded quality. They are not agents of chaos. They are workers within a system. In later Mesopotamian literature, the term Igigi sometimes becomes more generalised, referring to gods of heaven collectively. This fluidity suggests that over centuries distinctions blurred. However, in the earlier layers relevant to their rebellion, the differentiation is maintained. They are assigned tasks by Enlil. They dig the beds of rivers, They raise embankments. They carve irrigation channels. The repetitive nature of this work is emphasized. It is not creative in the way Enki's later shaping of humanity will be described. It is maintenance. Maintenance is often undervalued until it ceases. The Igigi's identity is therefore tied to repetition. They wake, dig, carry, return. The cosmos depends on their consistency. The tablets do not describe their internal conversations in detail before the uprising. We are not given extended monologues of frustration. Instead, the narrative moves from long labour to sudden collective action. The implication is that dissatisfaction grew gradually, silently. One can imagine that in divine assemblies the Igigi did not sit among the senior council. Their voices did not carry equal weight. Their tasks were practical rather than legislative. This arrangement reflects a worldview in which power is concentrated. The Anunnaki's authority derives from lineage and domain. The Igigi's position derives from assignment. In ancient Mesopotamia, social stratification was clear. Free citizens, dependent labourers, slaves, priests and kings. The divine mirror of this structure reinforces its inevitability. If even gods are divided by rank, then human hierarchy feels naturalised. Yet the Igigi's later refusal challenges that inevitability. It demonstrates that even within divine order, imbalance can reach a breaking point. The myth does not provide detailed genealogies for most of the Igigi. They are a collective rather than individually named figures. This anonymity reinforces their role as workforce. They are many rather than singular heroes. When they act together. Their collective identity contrasts with the individualized authority of the Anunnaki. Enlil has a dwelling, Anu has a throne, Enki has a defined domain, the Igigi have each other. This solidarity becomes crucial later, but even in their labouring years, it likely fostered shared experience. Digging side by side for decades would create common understanding. The imagery of carrying baskets of earth resonates deeply with Mesopotamian archaeological remains. Excavations at ancient sites reveal the scale of canal systems required to sustain cities. The myth situates the Igigi as pre-human equivalents of those labourers. Their tools, described in the rebellion narrative as being burned, symbolise their identity. The implements of digging are extensions of their role. When the time comes for defiance, they do not turn those tools into weapons against the Anunnaki. They destroy them. This act is significant. It is not an attempt to seize power through violence. It is a refusal to continue labour. Before that moment, however, their existence is defined by compliance. They fulfill the commands issued from above. The rivers deepen. The land becomes arable. The world under the Anunnaki's rule takes shape. The Igigi's identity also highlights an important aspect of Mesopotamian theology. The gods are not abstract moral ideals. They operate within systems of obligation and expectation. They experience tension. They respond to imbalance. In this context, the Igigi are not tragic figures doomed from the start. They are participants in a structured cosmos whose role gradually becomes untenable. Their portrayal lacks villainous traits. They are not depicted as deceitful or malicious prior to the rebellion. Their defining characteristic is labour. This detail becomes significant when compared to later mythological traditions in other cultures, where rebellious divine beings are often cast as embodiments of pride or corruption. The Igigi's complaint centres on workload, not ambition. The narrative suggests that their grievance is understood, at least partially, by the senior gods once voiced. This indicates that their position was not inherently criminal. It was burdensome. Their place within the divine hierarchy can therefore be understood as functional rather than moral. They are neither exalted nor condemned. They are assigned. Over time, the strain of that assignment transforms their identity from compliant labourers into organised dissenters. But in the period before protest, they remain defined by duty. They dig the rivers that will later sustain human civilization. They shape the land without ever knowing that another species will one day inherit the work. The Igigi's existence in the myth underscores a foundational theme in Mesopotamian thought. Order requires effort. The world does not sustain itself automatically. It must be maintained. That maintenance, in the earliest phase of the cosmos, rests on their shoulders. Their number, though not precisely fixed in surviving texts, is implied to be large. They are a host rather than a handful. This multiplicity suggests that their labour spans vast areas of the landscape. In the Atrahasis account, when they finally rise in protest, they approach Enlil's dwelling as a unified body. That unity reflects shared identity formed through shared burden. Yet before torches flare and gates are surrounded, the Igigi remain what they were assigned to be, divine labourers in a hierarchical system governed by the Anunnaki. Their story at this stage is quiet. It unfolds beneath the commands of senior gods, and above the yet unformed humanity that will one day replace them. They carry the weight of Earth without anticipation of relief, and as the decades pass within the mythic timeline, the steady rhythm of digging continues, shaping not only the physical world but also the collective resolve that will soon alter the structure of the cosmos itself. In the years before the refusal, before the tools were set down and the night of defiance unfolded, the work itself defined existence for the Igigi. It was not occasional service or ceremonial duty. It was continuous labour, embedded into the daily rhythm of the cosmos. The world under the rule of the Anunnaki did not maintain itself. It required effort, and that effort rested on divine shoulders. The Atrahasis epic describes the Igigi digging the great riverbeds, carving out the Tigris and Euphrates. Whether meant literally or symbolically, the imagery is unmistakable. They carried baskets of soil, they excavated channels, they shaped the terrain. The language does not soften the task. It is heavy, it is repetitive, it is sustained. In the Mesopotamian environment, water management was everything. Floods could be catastrophic, drought could destroy entire harvests. Canals had to be deepened and cleared of silt, embankments reinforced, irrigation networks extended. These were not one-time projects, they demanded constant attention. Transposed into myth, these tasks become divine labour. The Igigi's work likely spanned both heaven and earth within the narrative imagination. Some interpretations suggest they tended celestial mechanisms as well, maintaining the courses of heavenly bodies. While the Atrahasis text emphasises terrestrial labour, other traditions describe divine beings assigned to the regulation of cosmic order more broadly. Heaven in Mesopotamian cosmology was not an abstract distant realm devoid of function. It was structured. The stars followed paths. The sun rose and set with consistency. The moon cycled predictably. These regularities were often attributed to divine oversight. It would not have been difficult for ancient listeners to imagine younger gods tasked with ensuring that such rhythms continued uninterrupted. On Earth, the burden was tangible. Digging riverbeds and canals meant lifting Earth repeatedly, carrying it away and depositing it elsewhere. The baskets mentioned in the text evoke the same tools used by human labourers in later centuries. Clay tablets discovered in Mesopotamian cities record work quotas and rations for canal diggers. The divine myth mirrors the human economy of effort. The burden of the Igigi was not framed as noble sacrifice. It was obligation. The senior gods did not share this burden. The Anunnaki presided in assembly, deliberated on matters of order and defined roles. Their authority depended on the stability produced by the Igigi's labour, yet they remained physically removed from the toil. This separation between oversight and execution created imbalance. The myth does not immediately present this imbalance as unjust. It is simply the way the cosmos is arranged. Yet over time, repetition without reprieve transforms duty into strain. 40 years of labour are mentioned in many renderings of the Atrahasis narrative. The number 40, recurring across ancient Near Eastern literature, often signifies a complete span or long endurance. Whether literal or symbolic, the duration emphasises longevity. The Igigi did not protest after a season. They endured. Immortality complicates the idea of fatigue. Unlike humans, the Igigi do not age or weaken physically, yet the text conveys exhaustion. This suggests that in Mesopotamian thought, weariness is not solely a function of aging. It is a product of sustained effort without variation. Day after day, divine hands shaped the land. The repetition becomes almost mechanical, digging, carrying, returning, beginning again. There is no description of reward beyond continuation of the system. The work sustains order, but it offers no elevation in status. The Igigi's burden also carries psychological weight. To labour indefinitely without prospect of change can erode patience. In the myth, this erosion happens gradually. The narrative does not dramatise each moment of frustration. It condenses decades into a summary of toil. Yet beneath that summary lies implied experience, shared glances between workers, unspoken complaints. The slow realisation that the arrangement may never shift. In human societies of ancient Mesopotamia, labourers were often compensated with rations of barley and oil. Their work was necessary but rarely glorified. The mythic Igigi receive no such compensation described in the text. Their sustenance is inherent to their divine nature. Their reward is continuation. This absence of incentive reinforces the sense of burden. It is also worth noting that the labour assigned to the Igigi is foundational. Without canals, fields cannot flourish. Without directed rivers, settlement is impossible. The myth situates the origins of civilization in divine sweat. Later, when humans inherit these tasks, they do so unaware of the divine precedent. They will dig the same canals. They will reinforce the same embankments. They will complain of the same exhaustion. The burden thus transfers across species. In the pre-human world, however, there is no alternative workforce. The Anunnaki rely entirely on the Igigi. This reliance is practical but unbalanced. Authority assumes permanence of compliance. As decades pass, the divine labourers begin to perceive their position differently. The work is not temporary, it is structural. The myth emphasises the physicality of their tasks to underscore the seriousness of their grievance. This is not abstract dissatisfaction, it is bodily strain. In some interpretations, the Igigi are described as digging the beds of the primordial rivers that later define Mesopotamian geography. The Tigris and Euphrates are not merely natural features, they are products of divine effort. This elevates the importance of the Igigi's role even as it highlights their exploitation. The heavens may also have required maintenance. The cyclical movement of celestial bodies, essential for agricultural timing, could be imagined as supported by unseen divine labour. If so, the Igigi's burden extended beyond Earth. Such an interpretation aligns with later Mesopotamian astronomical traditions in which deities are associated with specific stars and planets. Maintaining cosmic regularity would not be passive, it would require attention. Whether on Earth or in the sky, the theme remains consistent. The Igigi sustain order through effort. Over time, effort without agency breeds resentment. The myth does not record initial complaints to the Anunnaki. There is no early negotiation. The Igigi endure silently for years. Silence in the face of hierarchy is common in both divine and human narratives. Authority often assumes that absence of protest equals contentment. The Atrahasis text demonstrates otherwise. The burden of the divine workers becomes unbearable not because the tasks are new, but because they never end. The Igigi's tools become symbols of their identity. Baskets for carrying earth, implements for digging. These objects are extensions of their role. To destroy them later is to reject not only labour, but assigned identity. In the years leading up to that act, the tools remain in constant use. One can imagine the rhythm of work synchronised among countless divine figures. The earth slowly reshaped under their hands. Channels deepened, waters redirected. The Anunnaki likely observed progress from elevated positions, satisfied with results. The system functioned. The world became increasingly ordered. Yet beneath this order lay imbalance. The burden was not distributed evenly. decision-makers did not share in the physical toll. Over time, awareness of this disparity sharpened among the Igigi. Their immortality may have intensified the sense of stagnation. A human labourer might hope for eventual rest in death. An immortal worker faces endless repetition. The myth does not explicitly state this psychological dimension, but it is implicit. Endurance without endpoint can feel heavier than finite hardship. The burden of the divine workers thus becomes more than physical. It becomes existential. Their labour shapes the world but does not alter their status. The hierarchy remains fixed, authority remains distant. In the divine assembly, the Anunnaki likely discussed matters of governance and cosmic balance. The Igigi, meanwhile, continued to dig. The contrast is stark. It is within this contrast that collective awareness forms. The workers recognise shared experience. They begin to see their burden not as isolated fatigue but as systemic imbalance. This recognition does not explode immediately into rebellion, it simmers. In human history, revolts often follow prolonged periods of strain rather than sudden injustice. The Igigi's story mirrors this pattern. The myth compresses decades into brief lines, yet those lines carry weight. 40 years of labour, 40 years of digging rivers, 40 years of carrying baskets. The burden accumulates quietly until it can no longer be ignored. The world under the Anunnaki appears stable from above. From below it feels heavy, and as the rhythm of digging continues, as canals lengthen and embankments rise, the divine workers begin to shift from endurance toward decision, their burden no longer something to bear indefinitely, but something to confront together. The texts are brief when they speak of duration, but the weight of that duration carries through every line. 40 years. In the Atrahasis tradition, that number appears as the span of time the Igigi laboured before their patience gave way. Whether literal or symbolic, it conveys something unmistakable. This was not a momentary grievance. It was not impatience after a short assignment. It was endurance stretched to its limit. 40 years of digging. 40 years of lifting soil from riverbeds and piling it into embankments. 40 years of maintaining a world that did not yet contain humanity. In Mesopotamian literature, numbers often function with layered meaning. The number 7 appears frequently, as does 12. 40 is another recurring figure, often representing a complete period or an extended trial. It marks transition. It marks the span required for something to change. For the Igigi, 40 years of toil marked the transition from compliance to refusal. Immortality complicates the concept of exhaustion. Humans measure hardship partly by its proximity to death. Finite life can make labour tolerable because it has an end point. The Igigi did not possess that end point. Their existence stretched forward without natural conclusion. If the labour never ceased, neither would they. The myth suggests that immortality did not insulate them from fatigue. This detail reveals much about how ancient Mesopotamians conceptualized their gods. Divinity did not remove emotion or strain. The gods were powerful, but they were not detached from experience. 40 years of repetition can erode resolve even in beings who do not age. The daily routine likely felt identical, digging canals along the great rivers, reinforcing the banks to prevent overflow, clearing silt after seasonal flooding. The world required constant adjustment. It is worth remembering that southern Mesopotamia was a challenging environment. The rivers did not behave predictably. Their waters could surge unexpectedly or recede too far. Silt accumulated rapidly. Without maintenance, irrigation networks collapsed. Translating that environment into myth makes the Igigi's work continuous by necessity. There was no season of rest. Water had to be managed year after year. The Anunnaki's authority depended on this management. Their decrees were meaningful only if the world functioned. The Igigi ensured that function. Yet the system did not evolve to ease their burden. There is no mention of rotation of duties, no suggestion that the Anunnaki shared in the digging to lighten the load. Hierarchy remained rigid. The phrase 40 years of toil captures not only duration but accumulation, each year layered upon the previous one, each season repeating the same motions. Immortality without variation can become indistinguishable from imprisonment. The Igigi were not prisoners in chains, but they were bound by expectation. Their role defined them. To step outside, it required collective decision. One can imagine that at first, dissatisfaction appeared in small gestures. A pause longer than usual before lifting a basket. A glance exchange between workers. Quiet acknowledgement that the labour was relentless. The Atrahasis text condenses this psychological build-up into a single moment of uprising, but the years preceding it must have shaped that decision. 40 years in divine time may not correspond to human years exactly, yet the narrative presents them as long enough to justify action. It suggests that endurance had been tested thoroughly. Immortality, often imagined as blessing, becomes burden when paired with unending labour. In human cultures, myths frequently portray gods as desiring worship and offerings from mortals. In this earlier phase, before humanity exists, the gods do not receive offerings. They receive only the maintenance produced by the Igigi's work. This absence of ritual exchange may have intensified the imbalance. The Igigi laboured not only without rest, but without recognition. The Anunnaki presided in assembly. They deliberated on cosmic matters. The Igigi dug, 40 years without upward mobility. The monotony would have been profound. Repetition can dull even divine perception, each day blending into the next. The rivers deepened gradually, but the act of deepening them remained constant. Immortality removes the urgency of immediate change but can magnify long-term dissatisfaction. If one expects to exist forever, then a single assignment extending indefinitely can feel suffocating. The myth does not describe aging among the Igigi, but it describes weariness. Weariness implies internal depletion, not physical decay. In some later mythological traditions, rebellious divine beings are driven by pride or ambition. The Igigi's grievance is simpler. They are tired. Tired of digging. Tired of carrying. Tired of serving a hierarchy that did not shift. 40 years of toil suggest that patience was not absent. They did not revolt immediately. They gave the system time to adjust on its own. When adjustment did not come, frustration crystallized. The number 40 also echoes later flood narratives in the broader ancient Near Eastern tradition. Periods of 40 days or years often mark transition from one state to another. In this case, 40 years of labour marked the transition from compliance to rebellion. The Igigi's immortality meant that they could endure far longer than humans might. That they chose to act after 40 years suggests that their threshold had been crossed decisively. The divine assembly likely assumed that immortality ensured infinite endurance. They may have underestimated the psychological toll of repetition. This miscalculation reveals something subtle about hierarchy. Authority often assumes that subordinates will continue functioning indefinitely under existing conditions. 40 years of toil proved otherwise. The Igigi's identity as labourers had been fixed for decades. They had internalized their role. To step outside, it required redefining themselves. The moment they began to consider refusal, the entire cosmic order became unstable. Immortality was not enough to compensate for lack of agency. The Atrahasis epic describes them eventually gathering in secret. That gathering did not arise from a single bad day. It was born of accumulated strain. 40 years created solidarity. Shared hardship binds groups together. The Igigi likely developed collective identity through shared experience. The absence of named individuals among them reinforces this. They are a body rather than heroes. Their unity emerges from uniform burden. One can imagine that at some point someone voiced aloud what others had felt silently. The labour is too heavy. The assignment has no end. That voice found agreement. Immortality might have allowed them to postpone action indefinitely, but postponement without hope becomes resignation. the Igigi did not choose resignation. The decision to rebel was not spontaneous chaos. It was calculated risk after prolonged endurance. 40 years of toil provided moral justification in their own eyes. They had served long enough. The Anunnaki's response later indicates that the senior gods recognized the legitimacy of the complaint, even if they did not welcome the method of protest. Immortality without dignity becomes hollow. The Igigi were divine. They were not created as tools, yet their role reduced them to instruments of maintenance. 40 years sharpened that realization. As seasons turned and rivers swelled and receded, the burden remained constant. The baskets grew no lighter. The canals demanded no less attention. The world flourished under their effort, yet their position did not improve. Immortality promised endless existence. It did not promise endless contentment. The Igigi reached the conclusion that endless labour was not acceptable simply because they could survive it. 40 years of toil had demonstrated that endurance alone would not alter hierarchy, and so endurance shifted toward decision. The moment approached when tools would be set aside not from fatigue alone, but from resolve, as the divine workers prepared to transform 40 years of silent strain into open defiance. 40 years of labour had passed without formal complaint. The rivers had been dug, the embankments raised, the soil carried basket by basket under the supervision of distant authority. Outwardly, nothing had changed. The canals continued to function. The Anunnaki continued to preside. Yet beneath that steady surface, something shifted. Rebellion does not usually begin with shouting. It begins with quiet recognition. A glance held a little longer than usual, a pause in rhythm, the realization that the exhaustion shared by one is shared by many. The atrahasis narrative compresses this transformation into a brief passage, but its implications are layered. The Igigi, after decades of toil, gathered at night. The text suggests secrecy. It was not an impulsive daytime protest. It was organized in shadow. Night in Mesopotamian imagination was not merely absence of light. It was a time when boundaries felt thinner. Decisions taken at night carried a different weight. The Igigi chose that setting deliberately. Under cover of darkness, they could speak without immediate oversight. One can imagine the scene without embellishment, tools resting beside them, bodies accustomed to labour finally still, the earth around them shaped by their own hands, the rivers flowing quietly nearby. Whispers begin. The Atrahasis epic does not record individual speeches. It does not assign leadership to a single instigator. The Igigi speak collectively. Their complaint is unified. The labour is too heavy. The burden has become unbearable. 40 years have been enough. The absence of a named leader is significant. This was not the ambition of one divine figure seeking power. It was a collective recognition of imbalance. In hierarchical systems, dissent often requires courage because authority can respond with punishment. The Igigi were aware of the Anunnaki's power. They understood the risks of defiance, yet the accumulated strain outweighed fear. The night gathering marks the first active step toward confrontation. Before this moment, dissatisfaction existed internally. After this moment, it became organized. The decision they reached was not subtle. They would no longer work. They would confront Enlil directly. The tools, symbols of their role, would be destroyed. Burning tools is an act layered with meaning. It eliminates the possibility of immediate return to labour. It signals finality of intent. It is not a negotiation tactic. It is a declaration. The Atrahasis text describes the Igigi setting fire to their implements. The image is striking. Divine beings standing together as flames consume the baskets, and digging tools that had defined their existence for decades. Fire in Mesopotamian culture carried purifying and transformative connotations. To burn the tools was to sever connection with imposed identity. This was not sabotage of the canals. They did not destroy the rivers they had shaped. They destroyed only the means by which they were expected to continue shaping them. After the fire, they marched. The destination was Enlil's dwelling, the chief administrator of Earth, the authority who had assigned their labour. The decision to approach Enlil rather than Anu suggests practicality. Enlil was the operative ruler. He issued commands. He managed the structure of the world. Confronting him addressed the source of their burden directly. The march itself carries symbolic weight. The Igigi moved together, not as scattered dissenters but as a unified body. Their numbers would have been significant. The text implies a large host surrounding Enlil's residence. The visual is powerful, lesser gods encircling the gate of authority. Inside, the Anunnaki were startled. The narrative describes fear among them. This fear is revealing. The senior gods did not dismiss the protest as trivial. They recognized its potential to destabilize order. The Igigi's collective presence outside Enlil's dwelling represented a fracture in hierarchy. Rebellion in myth often escalates quickly to violence. In this case, the Igigi did not attack. They surrounded. They demanded attention. Their refusal to continue labour was already disruptive enough. Without the Igigi, maintenance ceased. The night of whispers had become the night of confrontation. Enlil demanded to know the instigator. He sought an individual to punish. This is a familiar pattern in hierarchical systems. If rebellion can be attributed to a single agitator, order can be restored through targeted discipline. The Igigi answered differently. They spoke as one. There was no single leader. The grievance belonged to all. This collective stance prevented Enlil from isolating blame. Punishing one would not resolve the underlying issue. The unity forged during 40 years of shared labour now manifested as solidarity and defiance. The Anunnaki faced a choice: crush the rebellion and risk losing their workforce entirely, or acknowledge the burden and seek alternative solutions. The night setting emphasises the tension. Darkness around the dwelling, flames from the burn tools still smouldering in memory, the silence broken by divine voices. The Igigi's demand was straightforward. They would not continue digging. The text does not describe threats of overthrow. It does not portray an attempt to seize the throne. The rebellion's aim was relief, not dominion. This distinction matters. The Igigi did not seek to replace the Anunnaki. They sought freedom from imposed labour. Enlil's reaction was anger. Authority challenged is rarely calm, yet even in his anger, deliberation followed. The Anunnaki gathered in assembly. Fear mingled with frustration. The Night of Whispers had forced the senior gods to confront a reality they had not anticipated. The system was not self-sustaining. It depended on consent as much as command. The Igigi's willingness to risk confrontation revealed depth of dissatisfaction. If immortals were willing to defy authority after 40 years, the burden had indeed been severe. The myth does not romanticize the moment. It presents it with procedural clarity. Gathering, burning tools, surrounding the dwelling, speaking collectively. The rebellion began not with chaos, but with organized refusal. The significance of this moment extends beyond the immediate conflict. It establishes a pattern in Mesopotamian mythology, where creation arises from crisis. Without the Night of Whispers, humanity would not be created in this narrative. The Igigi's refusal becomes catalyst. Yet at this stage, humanity does not exist. The confrontation is purely divine. The cosmos trembles not because mortals challenge gods, but because gods challenge gods. The Anunnaki's fear reflects recognition that hierarchy alone cannot sustain order if the foundation rejects its role. The night stretched on as deliberation began. The Igigi stood firm outside Enlil's dwelling. The Anunnaki considered their options inside. No lightning bolts were thrown. No immediate punishment fell. The balance of power had shifted subtly. The younger gods had demonstrated unity. 40 years of toil had led to this precise configuration. Flames extinguished, tools reduced to ash. divine labourers standing together in defiance. The rebellion began quietly, in whispers and firelight, but its consequences would reshape the cosmos as the Anunnaki prepared to respond to a challenge that could not be ignored. The tools had burned. The decision had been made. What followed was not retreat into hesitation, but movement. The Igigi did not scatter after their night of whispers. They advanced. The Atrahasis narrative presents the moment with directness. The younger gods marched toward the dwelling of Enlil. They surrounded it. The text uses language that evokes encirclement, a tightening ring of divine presence around the centre of authority. Enlil's residence was not an abstract symbol. In Mesopotamian imagination, the gods possessed temples and abodes structured much like human palaces. Architecture mirrored hierarchy. High gods occupied elevated spaces. Their dwellings were fortified, defined by gates and thresholds. To approach such a gate uninvited was an act heavy with implication. The Igigi came not as petitioners carrying offerings, but as labourers carrying grievance. Their tools were gone, their hands were empty. That emptiness signalled refusal. The march itself likely unfolded in silence at first. The image of countless divine figures moving together toward Enlil's dwelling conveys discipline rather than chaos. This was not a riot born of disorder. It was a coordinated action. The canals lay unattended behind them. The rivers flowed without new reinforcement. For the first time in decades, the rhythm of digging had ceased. Inside the residence, the Anunnaki became aware of the movement. The text suggests alarm. It does not portray indifference. The senior gods recognized that this was not routine. Encirclement carries symbolic force. When a ruler's dwelling is surrounded, authority is tested. The Igigi did not need to breach the gates to demonstrate their power. Their presence at the threshold was enough. Enlil's first instinct was inquiry. He demanded to know who had instigated the uprising. The assumption that rebellion requires a singular agitator reveals much about hierarchical thinking. Authority often seeks a head to sever rather than a system to examine. The Igigi denied that structure. They spoke collectively. They had all laboured. They were all exhausted. No single god had manipulated the others. The grievance belonged to the whole. This collective stance transformed the situation from a disciplinary matter into structural crisis. The Anunnaki could not isolate the problem to one rebellious figure. The entire workforce stood outside the gate. Fear is an unusual but recurring emotion in Mesopotamian depictions of the gods. In this moment, fear appears among the senior assembly. Not fear of immediate destruction, but fear of instability. If the Igigi refused to work, the world would deteriorate, canals would clog, rivers would overflow or dry unpredictably. The delicate balance of order would falter. The siege, though non-violent, exerted pressure. The Igigi did not storm the residence. They did not attack Enlil. Their strategy was presence. Presence at the gate prevented normalcy. It disrupted the expected flow of divine governance. The Anunnaki convened in assembly to deliberate. Anu was consulted. Enki listened. The situation demanded a response that preserved hierarchy while resolving the labour crisis. The Igigi's encirclement functioned as leverage. They had already burned their tools. They had no intention of resuming work under previous conditions. One can imagine the tension at the threshold, the younger gods standing outside in unity, the senior gods within, weighing options. Enlil's anger is noted in the text. Authority challenged often responds first with indignation, yet anger alone could not restore the canals. The Igigi's action demonstrated that physical labour holds power. Without those who dig, even divine rulers are constrained. The siege was not about replacing the Anunnaki. It was about forcing recognition. This moment marks a rare instance in ancient myth where lower-ranking divine beings confront higher authority not to usurp, but to renegotiate. The language of the Atrahasis text emphasizes the seriousness of the confrontation. The gods of heaven were disturbed. The noise of the encirclement carried upward. Even Anu in the high heavens became aware. The collective refusal echoed beyond Enlil's gate. The Anunnaki's fear was practical. They could punish the Igigi, but at what cost? Destroying the entire labour force would leave the world unmanaged. The siege exposed dependence. Hierarchy had obscured that dependence until it was withdrawn. The Igigi's strength lay not in superior power, but in indispensability. Encircling the dwelling also inverted spatial hierarchy. Instead of looking upward toward the residence of authority, the Igigi formed a boundary around it. The centre was no longer secure. The Atrahasis narrative does not describe physical violence at this stage. There is no clash of weapons. The confrontation is verbal and positional. Enlil demanded identification of the instigator. The Igigi refused to offer one. This refusal demonstrated unity that had been forged through decades of shared labour. The Anunnaki realised that the rebellion was not the whim of a few, but the will of many. Deliberation followed. Anu asked for calm. Enki began to consider alternatives. The siege forced creativity. Without the Igigi, maintenance would cease. If maintenance ceased, order would crumble. If order crumbled, the Anunnaki's authority would lose meaning. The younger gods had positioned themselves at the very gate of power, not to destroy it, but to reveal its reliance on their effort. The image of divine beings surrounding Enlil's residence carries echoes of later human uprisings in ancient cities. When citizens gathered outside palace gates, rulers were compelled to respond. The myth captures a universal dynamic. Authority and labour are interdependent. The siege lasted long enough to generate fear but not violence. The Igigi held their ground. Inside, the senior gods weighed options that would preserve hierarchy without reinstating the old burden. Enki, associated with wisdom and invention, would soon propose a solution that would alter the structure of existence itself. But in this moment, before solution, the tension remained. The gate stood between the two groups. On one side, decades of toil and unified refusal. On the other, centuries of established authority. The Igigi's march had brought the imbalance into full view. Their encirclement transformed silent strain into visible crisis. The Anunnaki could not ignore what stood outside their dwelling, and as the deliberation deepened within the assembly, the siege at Enlil's gate held steady, marking the point at which divine labourers forced the high gods to reconsider the very architecture of their world. The encirclement did not end in immediate confrontation. It ended in something more unsettling for the Anunnaki: realization. For the first time since the world had been set in motion, those who ruled it understood that their authority depended on consent. The Igigi had not stormed the gates. They had not attempted to overthrow Enlil. They had simply stopped working and stood together, and that was enough to make the masters tremble. The Atrahasis text conveys the reaction of the senior gods with restrained clarity. The noise of the uprising disturbed them. The sight of the younger gods surrounding Enlil's dwelling created alarm. It was not merely the presence of protest that frightened them. It was what that protest implied. The canals were unfinished. The rivers required constant attention. Without labour, the world would begin to deteriorate. The Anunnaki understood infrastructure. Their governance was administrative, not ornamental. They knew that if the Igigi held firm, maintenance would cease entirely. The foundations of order would erode. Fear, in this context, was practical. Enlil's anger had surfaced first, but anger does not solve systemic breakdown. The senior gods gathered in assembly, not in triumph, but in uncertainty. Anu was informed. As the highest authority in the heavens, his awareness of the situation elevated it from regional dispute to cosmic concern. The rebellion was no longer a localized grievance. It was a fracture in the structure of divine society. The text describes the Anunnaki as sitting together, disturbed by what had occurred. Their reaction suggests that the possibility of rebellion had not been seriously considered before. Authority had been assumed permanent. Now permanence felt fragile. The Igigi had not only withdrawn their labour, they had demonstrated unity. That unity was more threatening than individual dissent. When Enlil demanded the name of the instigator and received no answer, the magnitude of the problem became clear. Punishment of one would not restore compliance. The entire workforce stood outside the gate. The masters trembled because their power, though vast, was limited by dependence. In human societies of ancient Mesopotamia, rulers relied on labourers for canal construction, temple building, and agriculture. If labour ceased, cities suffered. The divine mirror of that reality made the Anunnaki's fear understandable to ancient listeners. The myth does not portray the Anunnaki as omnipotent beyond constraint. They operate within systems. Those systems require participants. The Igigi's refusal exposed the Anunnaki's reliance. Fear among the senior gods did not manifest as panic. It manifested as deliberation. They convened in assembly to consider options. This suggests that even in crisis, hierarchy and procedure persisted. Anu's voice likely carried authority in this moment. Enlil's anger needed tempering. Enki's insight would soon become central. But before solution came recognition. Recognition that the balance of power had shifted. The Igigi, though lower in rank, possessed leverage. They were indispensable. The Anunnaki could have attempted coercion. They could have threatened destruction. Yet such measures would have undermined their own stability. If the Igigi were destroyed, who would dig the rivers? Who would maintain the canals? The fear was not of defeat in battle. It was of collapse through absence. The siege at the gate had forced the senior gods to confront a reality they had not anticipated. Labour has power. The Atrahasis narrative subtly emphasises that the Igigi's complaint was legitimate in scope. The text does not condemn them as traitors. Instead, it records the senior god's fear and subsequent search for compromise. This portrayal reflects a worldview where imbalance must be corrected for order to survive. Enlil's initial impulse may have been punishment, yet the collective nature of the rebellion complicated that response. The Anunnaki's trembling reveals vulnerability rarely associated with gods in later traditions. They are not distant and unshakable. They are administrators whose system is under strain. The fear also extended beyond immediate infrastructure. If lower-ranking gods could defy authority successfully, what precedent would that set? Would hierarchy unravel further? The Anunnaki were guardians of order. The rebellion challenged that guardianship. Inside the assembly, tension likely ran high. Voices raised. Accusations perhaps exchanged. Enlil might have defended his assignments. Others might have questioned whether the burden had indeed been excessive. The myth does not detail every word spoken, but the implication of deliberation is clear. Fear can lead to rigidity or to adaptation. The Anunnaki chose adaptation. Before that decision crystallized, however, the tremor of uncertainty lingered. The Igigi remained outside the gate, unified and resolute. The senior gods remained inside, aware that their authority had been publicly challenged. The image is stark. Divine rulers confronted by the consequences of prolonged imbalance. The trembling of the masters was not weakness. It was recognition. Recognition that order sustained by force alone is unstable. Recognition that endurance has limits, even among immortals. Recognition that their governance required revision. In ancient Mesopotamian culture, kings were expected to maintain balance and justice. If they failed, the gods might withdraw favour. The divine narrative mirrors that expectation. The Anunnaki faced a moment where their own governance needed correction. The fear they experienced was therefore constructive. It prompted problem-solving rather than annihilation. The solution would soon emerge from Enki's mind. But in this moment, before solution, the Anunnaki sat in uneasy awareness that the foundation of their world was no longer secure. The Igigi had exposed the cost of rigidity. The masters trembled not because they lacked power, but because they understood that power without cooperation could not sustain creation. And as the assembly deliberated within the dwelling of Enlil, the path toward an unprecedented act of creation began to take shape. one that would redistribute labour and alter the relationship between gods and the world forever. Fear in the assembly did not remain suspended for long. The Anunnaki could not afford paralysis. The Igigi still stood outside Enlil's dwelling. The canal still required maintenance. The river still needed direction. Authority without a functioning world would be hollow. Within that tension, Enki began to think. Enki, also known in earlier Sumerian tradition as Ea in Akkadian texts, occupied a distinctive place among the senior gods. He was associated with the subterranean waters, with wisdom, with invention. Where Enlil often responded with severity, Enki responded with strategy. Where Anu embodied high sovereignty, Enki embodied problem-solving. The crisis unfolding at Enlil's gate demanded precisely that. The Atrahasis narrative positions Enki as the one who offers a solution that preserves hierarchy while addressing the grievance. He did not dismiss the Igigi's exhaustion. He did not propose crushing them. Instead, he suggested altering the structure of labour itself. The proposal was radical. If the younger gods refused to continue digging, another being could be fashioned to assume that burden. The Anunnaki had not previously required such a being. Before the rebellion, the world functioned through divine labour alone. Enki's idea introduced a new category of existence. The assembly listened. Creating a new species was not a trivial act. It required resources, intention, and sacrifice. Enki's reasoning appears pragmatic. The Igigi's labour had sustained the world for decades, but their refusal made continuation impossible. Rather than forcing them back into toil, Enki suggested transferring that toil. The proposal maintained the Anunnaki's authority. It relieved the Igigi. It ensured the world's continued functioning. Yet it also transformed the cosmic order. The text describes Enki advising that a lesser god be sacrificed, and that from the blood of that god mixed with clay, a new being be shaped. This being would carry the workload previously assigned to the Igigi. Sacrifice among the gods carried weight. It was not symbolic, it was literal in the narrative. One of their own would provide essence for the creation of another species. The god selected in many versions is named Geshtue or Wi'ila, described as possessing intelligence or rebellious spirit. His blood would mingle with the clay of the earth. From that mixture, humanity would arise. Enki's solution was both practical and irreversible. It acknowledged the Igigi's grievance without undermining the Anunnaki's dominance. It created a buffer between divine authority and physical labour. The Anunnaki deliberated. Enlil, whose authority had been directly challenged, likely weighed the risks carefully. Creating a new species carried unknown consequences. Yet the alternative, continued siege and halted maintenance, was untenable. Fear had opened the door to innovation. The Atrahasis text presents the decision with procedural clarity. The gods agreed. The sacrifice was performed. The clay was gathered. The act of mixing blood with earth carries symbolic resonance. Earth represents material substance. Blood represents divine essence. The new beings would be hybrid in origin. Enki's proposal did not erase the Igigi's existence. It redefined their position. They would no longer be responsible for digging canals. Their labour would be inherited by humanity. The radical nature of this solution lies in its acknowledgement that hierarchy alone could not resolve the crisis. A new class of being was required. The Anunnaki chose creation over coercion. This decision suggests a nuanced understanding of power. Force might compel temporary compliance, but structural change offers durability. Enki's wisdom often manifests as creative intervention in Mesopotamian mythology. Later, during the flood narrative, he will again act to preserve humanity despite Enlil's desire to destroy it. His role as mediator and innovator is consistent. In this earlier crisis, he acts to preserve divine stability by introducing mortal labour. The sacrifice of Geshtue is significant. His blood carried intelligence. Humanity would not be mindless tools. They would possess awareness, inherited from divine essence. This detail complicates the solution. The Igigi had refused because they were aware of their burden. The new beings would also possess awareness. Would they one day question their role? At this moment, however, the immediate concern was relief. The Igigi remained outside the gate as deliberation concluded. The Anunnaki announced their decision. Labour would be transferred. The divine workers would be freed. The creation process began. Clay from the earth was shaped. The blood of the sacrifice god infused it. Incantations were spoken. Forms took shape. The myth emphasizes that this act was deliberate. Humanity did not arise by accident. It was engineered as solution. Enki's radical alternative preserved hierarchy while reshaping it. The Igigi would no longer dig. They would resume positions within the divine order without the burden of physical toil. The Anunnaki would continue to rule. Humanity would emerge as intermediary. The siege at Enlil's gate thus resulted not in divine war but in creative transformation. The fear among the masters had led to innovation rather than annihilation. Enki's solution reveals something fundamental about Mesopotamian thought. Order must be maintained, but it can be adapted. The introduction of humanity also shifts the dynamic between gods and world. Until this moment, divine beings interacted directly with the Earth's physical processes. After this moment, mortals would become responsible for maintaining canals, fields, and temples. The divine realm would receive offerings rather than soil-stained hands. The Igigi's rebellion therefore becomes the hinge upon which human existence turns. Without their refusal, no such creation would have been necessary. Enki's proposal addressed the immediate crisis, but it also set in motion future tensions. Humanity, infused with divine blood, would not remain silent forever. Later in the Atrahasis narrative, human noise would disturb Enlil. Another crisis would arise. For now, however, the assembly's decision resolved the siege. The Igigi would be relieved. The world would continue to function. Enki's alternative to divine labour had been accepted. The radical act of creating a new species from clay and blood would reshape the structure of existence, as the first humans prepared to take up the baskets once carried by the gods. The decision had been made within the divine assembly. The siege at Enlil's gate would not end in punishment or renewed coercion. It would end in creation. Humanity did not emerge in this narrative as a spontaneous gift or an act of affection. It arose as a solution. The Igigi had refused to dig the canals. The Anunnaki required labour. Enki had proposed an alternative. The next step was execution. The Atrahasis epic describes the process with ritual precision. Clay was gathered from the earth. The location is sometimes specified as near the Apsu, the subterranean waters associated with Enki. The setting reinforces his involvement. Creation would take place under his guidance. A god was selected for sacrifice. In many versions, his name is given as Geshtui or Wiila. He's described as possessing intelligence or discernment. His role in the rebellion is not always clear, but the text emphasizes that his blood carried mind or spirit. The sacrifice was not chaotic. It was deliberate and communal. The Anunnaki agreed. The deed was carried out. The blood of the slain god was mixed with clay. This mixture was shaped into forms. Incantations accompanied the shaping. Words spoken by Enki and perhaps by the birth goddess, often identified as Nintu or Mami, infused the forms with life. The imagery is tactile, clay pressed and moulded, blood absorbed into earth, divine breath animating matter. From this mixture came humanity. The myth does not romanticize the moment. It frames it as practical. The purpose of the new beings is clear. They are to bear the workload once carried by the Igigi. The first humans were created not to rule, not to dominate, not to contemplate the cosmos. They were created to dig. In the Mesopotamian worldview, labour was fundamental to survival. The creation of humanity for labour reflects a society deeply aware of its dependence on irrigation and agriculture. The Igigi's rebellion thus becomes the direct catalyst for human existence. Without divine dissatisfaction, there would have been no need for substitution. The Anunnaki sphere had led to innovation. That innovation took the form of a new species. The infusion of divine blood into clay introduces complexity. Humanity would not be mere automatons. They would possess awareness derived from the sacrificed god. This detail suggests that the capacity for thought, and perhaps for future descent, was embedded from the beginning. The birth goddess, often central in the creation scene, is described as shaping the clay into human form. She recites incantations. She counts the days of gestation. In some versions, she creates multiple pairs at once. The text implies ritual structure. Creation was not accidental but ceremonial. The Igigi, freed from their burden, likely observed the process. The narrative does not describe their reaction in detail, but their relief is implied. The workload would shift. The Anunnaki had preserved hierarchy without crushing rebellion. Humanity entered the world carrying divine essence and earthly substance. The first humans would wake into existence with purpose assigned. They would take up tools similar to those burned by the Igigi. They would deepen canals. They would cultivate fields. They would build temples for the very gods whose crisis had created them. This arrangement established a new dynamic between gods and mortals. Humans would provide labour, and later, offerings. The gods would maintain cosmic order. The rebellion had introduced intermediation. The Atrahasis epic emphasises that humans were created to relieve the gods of toil. This origin shapes the subsequent narrative. When humans multiply and become noisy, Enlil grows frustrated again. The pattern of burden and complaint continues. For now, however, creation solved the immediate problem. The Igigi's refusal had been effective. They would no longer dig canals. The Anunnaki's authority remained intact. They had not been overthrown. The world would continue to function, now sustained by mortal hands. The first humans likely experienced their existence as immediate labour. There is no description of innocence or wandering in a garden. Their role was functional from the outset. Clay and blood fused into bodies capable of work. The infusion of divine blood ensured that humans possessed consciousness. They could think, plan, and perhaps question. Yet their lifespan would be finite, unlike that of the gods. Mortality introduced a new dimension to cosmic order. Humans would age and die. Their labour would be continuous across generations. The Igigi had endured 40 years of toil and reached a breaking point. Humans, limited in lifespan, would bear similar burdens but with an end point in death. The Anunnaki had solved one problem by introducing another category of being. The creation narrative also reinforces the theme that crisis generates change. The divine order did not evolve until challenged. The Igigi's rebellion was therefore foundational. Without their march to Enlil's gate, humanity would not have been conceived in this myth. The act of sacrifice embedded tension within creation. Humanity carries the blood of a slain god. That origin suggests latent potential. Enki's role in the process highlights his position as mediator between divine authority and emergent humanity. He shaped the solution. He oversaw the mixture of clay and blood. His wisdom bridged the gap created by rebellion. The Anunnaki's trembling had led to creative compromise. Humanity emerged as compromise incarnate. The first humans likely began their assigned tasks immediately. The canals awaited maintenance. The fields required tending. The world's infrastructure demanded continuity. The Igigi stepped back from labour. Their rebellion had not destroyed the system. It had restructured it. The Anunnaki remained rulers. Humanity became workers. The clay figures infused with divine essence began shaping the same earth from which they had been formed. Born from rebellion, humanity entered a world already defined by hierarchy and labour, inheriting the burden that had once driven the gods themselves to defiance. The clay had been shaped. The blood had been mixed. The incantations had been spoken with measured precision. The first humans stood not as accidental wanderers in a newly formed world, but as deliberate creations born of necessity. The atrahasis narrative makes no attempt to disguise the purpose behind their existence. Humanity was formed so that the gods would no longer have to bear the burden of digging canals and maintaining the land. The Igigi's long years of toil had come to an end. The world would now be sustained by mortal hands. The mixture of clay and divine blood was not merely symbolic. Clay represented the substance of the earth itself, malleable and abundant. Blood represented vitality and consciousness. By combining the two, the gods ensured that humans would possess both physical capacity and awareness. This awareness would prove significant. The first humans likely awoke into existence already embedded within a structure of expectation. They were not children discovering an untouched landscape. They were workers stepping into roles vacated by divine predecessors. The canals waited. The fields lay ready for cultivation. The embankments required reinforcement. Humanity inherited a world shaped by the Igigi, but not yet sustained by mortal effort. The Igigi, meanwhile, were relieved. The atrahasis text does not dwell on their reaction, but the implication is clear. Their labour ceased. The tools they had burned were no longer necessary. Their position within the divine hierarchy shifted from labourers to members of the heavenly host without manual obligation. The end of Igigi toil did not dissolve their existence. It transformed it. They remained gods, but their identity was no longer tied to physical burden. For the Anunnaki, the creation of humanity restored stability. The siege at Enlil's gate had forced them to reconsider their structure. Now, with mortals in place, order could resume. The first humans began to dig. They would have felt the weight of earth in their hands. They would have carried baskets of soil. They would have laboured under sun and sky without the immortality that had defined the Igigi. Mortality introduced urgency. Unlike the gods, humans would age. Their strength would wane. Their lives would end, yet their numbers would grow. The continuity of a labour would be sustained through reproduction rather than immortality. This shift altered the dynamics of endurance. The Igigi had endured 40 years before rebelling. Humans, bound by shorter lifespans, would endure within generational cycles. The divine blood within them ensured they were not mindless tools. They possessed intellect. They could organize, remember, and innovate. This inheritance would later create tension. In the immediate aftermath of creation, however, the arrangement appeared successful. The canals were maintained, the fields cultivated, the Anunnaki presided without direct involvement in physical labour. The Igigi's grievance had been resolved through substitution rather than suppression. The clay from which humans were formed symbolised their connection to the earth. They belonged to the land they worked. The divine blood symbolised their connection to the gods. They were intermediaries. This dual nature positioned humanity uniquely within the cosmic hierarchy. They were beneath the gods but not wholly separate. The myth suggests that the birth goddess oversaw the gestation of the first humans, counting days and ensuring proper formation. This detail reinforces the intentionality of the act. Humanity was crafted carefully. The end of Igigi toil marked a turning point in divine history. Before rebellion, gods shaped the world directly. After rebellion, mortals shaped it on their behalf. The Anunnaki's fear had led to innovation that permanently altered the cosmos. The Igigi's refusal had proven that even divine systems require adaptation. The first humans likely felt no awareness of the crisis that had preceded them. They would not have known that their existence was the result of divine exhaustion. They simply began to work. The myth's pragmatic tone underscores this. Humanity's purpose is explicit. They are to bear the yoke, as some translations render it. The yoke symbolises burden and responsibility. The Igigi had thrown off that yoke. Humans took it up. The exchange appears balanced from the perspective of the Anunnaki. The system functioned again. The rebellion had not dismantled hierarchy. It had redistributed effort. The divine assembly likely viewed the outcome as efficient. Yet embedding divine blood within mortal bodies, introduced potential unpredictability. Intelligence carries the capacity for reflection. Reflection can lead to dissatisfaction. For now, however, the immediate crisis was resolved. The Igigi resumed positions within the divine order free from manual labour. The Anunnaki continued to rule. Humanity laboured. The rivers flowed under new supervision. The world entered a new phase defined by the partnership between divine authority and mortal effort. The end of Igigi toil was not an end to labour itself. It was a transfer. Clay and blood had given rise to a species that would build cities, raise temples, and offer sacrifices to the very gods whose rebellion had necessitated their creation. The first humans likely worked without questioning the origin of their task. The fields required tending. Survival depended on irrigation. The pattern of work established by the Igigi continued uninterrupted. The Anunnaki's trembling had subsided. Order, reshaped, held firm. Yet the infusion of divine essence into mortal clay ensured that humanity would not remain passive indefinitely. The seeds of awareness planted at creation would eventually grow, just as dissatisfaction had once grown among the Igigi. For the moment, though, the burden had shifted successfully. The divine workers were free, the mortals were at work, and the world, once sustained by gods with baskets of earth, now turned under the steady hands of clay-born beings, carrying forward the labour that rebellion had transformed. The rebellion of the Igigi did not end in battle. No divine weapons clashed. No celestial bodies were shattered. Yet the memory of confrontation, of imbalance and correction, did not vanish when humanity took up the tools. It lingered beneath later traditions, echoing through stories of flood and fire that would emerge in Mesopotamian and neighbouring cultures. In the Atrahasis epic, the creation of humanity resolves one crisis but introduces another. The new beings multiply. They cultivate land. They build settlements. Over time, their numbers increase. With numbers comes noise. The text describes humanity as growing loud, disturbing the rest of Enlil. This detail is practical rather than mystical. A growing population strains resources. Irrigation networks expand. Settlements press against the limits of arable land. In the divine imagination, that strain manifests as noise reaching heaven. Enlil responds with measures aimed at reducing humanity. First come plagues, then drought. Each attempt to diminish human numbers is countered by Enki, who instructs a chosen human, often Atrahasis himself, on how to survive. The pattern resembles the earlier crisis between Anunnaki and Igigi. Burden leads to complaint. Authority attempts control. Intervention reshapes the outcome. Eventually Enlil decides upon a flood. The flood narrative within Atrahasis, and later in the Epic of Gilgamesh, bears similarities to other ancient Near Eastern traditions. A great deluge is sent to wipe out humanity. Enki again intervenes, instructing Atrahasis to build a vessel to preserve life. While the flood is framed as response to human noise rather than direct echo of Igigi rebellion, the thematic continuity is clear. Divine dissatisfaction leads to radical measures. The war between Igigi and Anunnaki did not involve weapons, but it established a precedent. Authority could be challenged. Structure could be altered. Creation could follow crisis. Flood and fire traditions across the ancient world often preserve memory of upheaval. In Mesopotamia, flood is the chosen instrument of reset. In other cultures, fire takes that role. Some later Mesopotamian myths hint at destructive conflagrations, though flood remains dominant. The imagery of overwhelming water serves both environmental memory and narrative symbolism. The Tigris and Euphrates could devastate cities when unmanaged. Flood was a real and recurring threat. The earlier rebellion of the Igigi was tied to water management. They dug canals to control rivers. Their refusal halted that control. The later flood narrative can be read as a reminder of what happens when water is unchecked. In that sense, the flood echoes the stakes of the original conflict. Without labour maintaining order, chaos returns. The Igigi's war was quiet but transformative. The flood is louder but structurally similar. Both represent moments when balance collapses and must be restored. Fire appears less prominently in Mesopotamian flood narratives but surfaces in broader ancient Near Eastern traditions. Destruction by flame serves as another symbol of purification and reset. The burning of the Igigi's tools on the Night of Whispers foreshadows this motif. Fire marks transition. The act of burning tools was not destructive to the world. It was destructive to identity. Later stories of fire destroying cities or landscapes echo that same symbolism of transformation. The flood in Atrahasis ends with sacrifice. Atrahasis offers offerings upon emerging from the vessel. The gods gather like flies around the scent, as one translation vividly puts it. Their dependence on human offerings becomes clear. Here again, the consequences of Igigi rebellion resonate. Humanity was created to bear labour. After the flood, humanity also becomes the source of sustenance for the gods through ritual sacrifice. The divine hierarchy adapts repeatedly. The flood story also introduces limits. After the deluge, measures are established to control human population, infertility, mortality, and priestly celibacy in some versions. The gods recognize that unchecked multiplication leads to renewed imbalance. This recognition parallels the earlier acknowledgement that unchecked burden leads to rebellion. The mythic cycles of flood and fire preserve memory of tension between creation and control. The Igigi's war was not retold as a blazing conflict, yet its consequences ripple forward. The creation of humanity leads to population growth. Growth leads to divine irritation. Irritation leads to flood. The war echoed in water. Other cultures surrounding Mesopotamia carried their own versions of flood narratives. The Hebrew Bible's account of Noah shares structural similarities with Atrahasis. Greek myths speak of Deucalion and Pyrrha surviving a flood sent by Zeus. In many traditions, humanity is nearly extinguished by water. While direct borrowing cannot always be proven, thematic resonance is undeniable. Flood becomes a narrative instrument for resetting imbalance. The earlier rebellion had introduced the concept that divine systems are not immune to strain. The flood continues that theme. Fire traditions, though less central in Mesopotamia, often symbolize judgment and purification in later mythologies. The burning of Sodom in biblical tradition, for example, reflects divine dissatisfaction leading to destruction. The Igigi's burning of tools was a smaller but meaningful act of purification. They removed the instruments of their oppression. The echo of that act can be traced symbolically in later stories where destruction clears ground for renewal. The Mesopotamian worldview was cyclical. Creation, disorder, correction. Labour, complaint, adaptation. The war between Igigi and Anunnaki introduced adaptation as response to strain. The flood narrative reinforces that adaptation sometimes requires drastic measures. The Igigi's confrontation did not destroy the cosmos. It transformed it through creation. The flood nearly destroyed humanity but ultimately preserved a remnant through instruction and foresight. Enki's consistent role in these episodes highlights the importance of mediation. He intervenes during the rebellion by proposing humanity. He intervenes during the flood by saving Atrahasis. His actions preserve continuity while allowing change. The echo of war in flood traditions reminds us that cosmic order in Mesopotamian myth is not static. It is negotiated repeatedly. Fire and water become symbols of correction. The Igigi's quiet siege at Enlil's gate initiated a chain of events that would shape subsequent myths of destruction and survival. In flood and fire traditions, we hear faint reverberations of that earlier night, when divine labourers stood together and forced the high gods to rethink their system. The conflict did not end with their relief. It seeded future crises. Humanity, born from rebellion, would one day stand at the brink of annihilation by flood. Yet just as the Igigi's unity altered divine order, a single human warned by Enki would preserve life and allow the world to continue. The war had not been fought with swords, but its consequences flowed like water and flared like fire through the stories that followed, carrying forward the memory of imbalance and adaptation into the broader tapestry of ancient tradition. The Igigi began in the oldest Mesopotamian layers as labourers. They dug canals, carried baskets of earth, and endured decades of toil. Yet as stories travelled across regions and centuries, the image of divine beings assigned to service began to shift. The memory of a class of younger gods who rebelled did not remain confined to a single tradition. It resonated in later myths, particularly in narratives that describe heavenly beings descending, observing, or transgressing boundaries. The transformation from workers to watchers is not explicit in the earliest tablets, but the parallels are striking enough to merit attention. In Mesopotamian sources, the Igigi are occasionally described as part of the heavenly host. In some later texts, the term becomes nearly interchangeable with Anunnaki, blurring distinctions between ranks. The earlier emphasis on manual labour fades, replaced by broader references to divine assemblies. Meanwhile, in the Hebrew tradition preserved in texts such as the Book of Genesis, and elaborated in later writings like the Book of Enoch, a group known as the Watchers appears. These beings descend from heaven, observe humanity, and in some accounts interact with them in ways that disrupt order. They are often portrayed as transgressors who teach forbidden knowledge and father offspring known as giants or Nephilim. The Igigi are not described in surviving Mesopotamian texts as descending to mate with humans or teaching forbidden arts. Their rebellion centres on labour rather than desire. Yet both traditions share structural elements: a lower-ranking group of divine beings, tension with higher authority, and consequences that reshape the human world. The Watchers of later tradition are assigned oversight. They observe. In some versions, their role as Watchers becomes corrupted. Curiosity leads to intervention. Intervention leads to disorder. Punishment follows. In contrast, the Igigi's rebellion results in relief rather than condemnation. They are not cast into abyss or chained beneath mountains. Their complaint is acknowledged, and a solution is found. Yet the motif of divine beings who operate beneath a higher authority, and who, at some point, disrupt the expected order links these narratives thematically. In Mesopotamian cosmology, hierarchy is clear. The Anunnaki preside, the Igigi serve. In later Hebrew tradition, God presides, angels or watchers serve. In both cases, a division of labour exists within the divine realm. The Igigi's collective action resembles the collective descent of the Watchers in Enochic literature. Unity among lower-ranking beings becomes central to both stories. However, the motivations differ. The Igigi seek relief from burden. The Watchers, in later tradition, are often motivated by desire or curiosity. Their transgression introduces corruption rather than administrative reform. It is possible that distant echoes of older Mesopotamian motifs filtered into neighbouring cultures through centuries of contact and shared storytelling. Mesopotamia influenced the Levant and beyond through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. Concepts of divine assemblies, flood narratives, and rebellious beings circulated widely. The Igigi's rebellion may not directly map onto the Watcher's descent, but the shared pattern of tension within the divine hierarchy invites comparison. Another parallel emerges in the idea of knowledge. The god's sacrifice to create humanity, Geshtui, was described as possessing intelligence. His blood infused humanity with awareness. In Enochic literature, the Watchers teach humans metallurgy, cosmetics, and other arts. Knowledge becomes a bridge between divine and human realms. The Mesopotamian creation story embeds divine intelligence within humanity from the start. The Watcher tradition depicts divine beings transmitting knowledge later. Both narratives explore the consequences of divine-human interaction. In the Igigi's case, humanity inherits labour. In the Watcher narrative, humanity inherits knowledge that disrupts order. The consequences differ in tone. The Igigi's rebellion results in structured adaptation. The Watcher's descent results in punishment and confinement. Yet both traditions acknowledge that the boundary between divine and human spheres is not impermeable. The transition from workers to watchers may reflect evolving theological concerns. In early Mesopotamia, the central issue was labour and irrigation. In later Jewish apocalyptic literature, the central issue became moral corruption and cosmic justice. Despite these differences, the underlying question remains similar. What happens when divine beings alter their assigned roles? The Igigi altered theirs by refusing to dig. The Watchers altered theirs by descending and teaching. In both cases, the change produces lasting effects on humanity. The Igigi's refusal led to humanity's creation. The Watchers' actions led to hybrid offspring and eventual divine judgment. The tone of the Mesopotamian narrative is pragmatic. The tone of the Enochic tradition is moralistic. Yet the structural similarity suggests shared conceptual ancestry, or at least shared mythic patterns. It is also worth noting that the term watcher in Aramaic and Hebrew contexts implies observation from a height. The Igigi, once freed from labour, could be imagined as part of the heavenly host observing the world sustained by human effort. In later Mesopotamian astronomical texts, gods are associated with stars and celestial bodies. The notion of divine beings watching from above fits within that cosmology. The transformation of myth over centuries often repurposes older motifs to address new concerns. The Igigi's rebellion addressed the distribution of labour. The Watchers' descent addressed the transmission of knowledge and moral boundaries. Yet beneath both lies the theme of divine hierarchy under strain. The Igigi were not evil. They were exhausted. The Watchers are often portrayed as fallen due to disobedience. The contrast reveals shifts in theological emphasis across cultures and time. In Mesopotamia, the solution to divine dissatisfaction was creative compromise. In Enochic tradition, the solution to divine transgression was punishment. Both narratives, however, preserve memory of tension within the divine realm. The movement from workers to watchers in cultural memory reflects changing human preoccupations. As societies evolved from primarily agrarian concerns to more abstract moral and cosmological questions, myths adapted accordingly. The Igigi's identity as labourers may have faded in prominence as later audiences focused more on celestial hierarchies than irrigation canals. Yet the memory of lower-ranking divine beings challenging order remained. The parallels do not require direct borrowing to be meaningful. Human cultures often generate similar motifs when grappling with power, hierarchy, and the relationship between heaven and earth. The Igigi stand at the beginning of that pattern in Mesopotamian myth. The Watchers represent a later iteration in a different cultural context. Both remind us that divine systems in ancient imagination were not static. They contained layers, tensions, and moments of crisis. The Igigi's story emphasizes structural adaptation. The Watcher's story emphasizes moral consequence. Together, they illustrate how ancient peoples used myth to explore the boundaries of authority and the impact of crossing them. The shift from workers to watchers does not erase the original narrative. It reframes it through evolving lenses. And as these echoes move through flood traditions, apocalyptic texts, and celestial hierarchies, the memory of a night when divine labourers stood together outside a gate continues to resonate in new forms, reshaped by each culture that inherited the pattern of rebellion within heaven. One of the most striking features of the Igigi narrative is what it does not say. The tablets that preserve their rebellion do not describe them as wicked. They are not labelled corrupt, demonic, or malicious. Their refusal is recorded, their grievance acknowledged, but the language remains measured. The Atrahasis epic does not cast them as enemies of order. It presents them as participants in a strange system. This absence of moral condemnation is important. In many later mythological and religious traditions, rebellion against divine authority becomes synonymous with evil. The act of defiance is framed as pride, arrogance, or corruption. Punishment follows swiftly and permanently. The narrative reinforces obedience as virtue. The Mesopotamian treatment of the Igigi is different. Their complaint centres on labour. The burden is described as heavy. The years of toil are emphasised. The rebellion arises not from ambition to rule, but from exhaustion. The text does not accuse them of desiring Enlil's throne. It does not depict them as seeking to overturn the cosmic order. They seek relief. This nuance reflects a worldview in which conflict within hierarchy is not automatically moralised. The Anunnaki respond with fear and anger, but not with denunciation of the Igigi's character. The assembly deliberates, a solution is proposed, adaptation occurs. The absence of condemnation suggests that the complaint was understood as legitimate. In ancient Mesopotamia, law codes such as the Code of Hammurabi demonstrate awareness of fairness within hierarchy. While society was stratified, there were expectations of proportional justice. The divine narrative mirrors this pragmatic approach. The Igigi endured 40 years before protesting. Their endurance establishes credibility. The tablets do not present the rebellion as sudden betrayal. They present it as accumulated strain reaching threshold. Language matters. The Atrahasis text describes the Igigi as bearing the yoke and digging the canals. It highlights the burden. It does not frame their refusal as sin. This distinction reveals that Mesopotamian theology was not primarily concerned with moral absolutism in the way later traditions often became. It focused on balance and function. The Igigi's labour sustained order. When the burden became excessive, order was threatened. The rebellion revealed imbalance. The response restored balance. There is no narrative of eternal punishment for the Igigi. They are not cast into darkness. They are not erased from divine assemblies. Their role changes, but their status remains within the heavenly host. This contrasts sharply with later stories of fallen angels, where disobedience results in exile or confinement. The Igigi's refusal is treated as problem within administration, rather than crime against holiness. The Anunnaki tremble because their system is destabilized, not because moral law has been violated. The tablet's tone is practical. It is also worth noting that Mesopotamian gods themselves are portrayed as flawed or reactive in many myths. Enlil can be harsh, Inanna can be impulsive, Enki can be cunning. Divinity is not equated with moral perfection. It is equated with power and function. Within such a framework, the Igigi's complaint does not require moral vilification. They are divine beings acting within a divine system. The rebellion resembles a labour strike more than a cosmic battle between good and evil. Ancient listeners, many of whom were labourers themselves, would likely have understood the weight of the grievance. Digging canals was arduous work. The myth elevates that experience to cosmic scale. By not calling the Igigi evil, the tablets preserve empathy. Empathy within myth is powerful. It allows audiences to see themselves reflected in divine narratives. The absence of condemnation also prevents the narrative from becoming binary. The Anunnaki are not depicted as tyrants. The Igigi are not depicted as villains. Both sides operate within constraints. The system was imbalanced. The rebellion exposed it. The solution corrected it. This approach aligns with a broader Mesopotamian emphasis on maintaining order through adjustment rather than moral absolutism. When humans later become too numerous and noisy, Enlil responds with plagues and flood. Even then, humanity is not labelled inherently evil. The problem is disturbance, not depravity. The flood narrative in Atrahasis does not frame human destruction as punishment for moral corruption. It frames it as response to excessive noise. This consistency in tone suggests that Mesopotamian theology centered on equilibrium rather than moral purity. The Igigi's rebellion fits within that pattern. They disrupted equilibrium by ceasing labor. The Anunnaki restored equilibrium by creating humanity. The tablet's neutrality toward the Igigi's character may also reflect scribal pragmatism. The story explains human origins. It does not aim to teach obedience through fear. Instead, it conveys that systems can adapt when strained. The absence of moral condemnation does not mean the rebellion was celebrated. It means it was contextualized. The Igigi were necessary before rebellion. They remained necessary afterward as members of the divine host. Their identity shifted from labourers to freed gods. The myth does not assign them shame. Later traditions often reinterpret older myths through new moral lenses. As monotheistic frameworks emerged, rebellion against divine authority became morally charged. The older Mesopotamian narrative predates that shift. In its original context, the Igigi were participants in cosmic administration, not archetypes of evil. Their story emphasizes endurance, solidarity, and structural change. By not calling them evil, the tablets preserve the complexity of their position. They were divine beings who reached the limit of tolerance. They acted collectively. Their action led to innovation rather than annihilation. The Anunnaki trembled, deliberated, and adapted. The world continued. The lack of moral condemnation allows the narrative to focus on consequences rather than judgment. It invites reflection on balance rather than obedience. In this way, the Igigi's story remains distinct from later myths of fallen beings. It is not about corruption of nature. It is about redistribution of burden. The tablets speak in administrative language rather than moral accusation. And in that restraint they preserve a rare example of rebellion within myth that is neither demonized nor glorified, but treated as catalyst for transformation within a living, adaptive cosmic order. The siege ended without bloodshed. The canals were reassigned. Humanity began its labour. The divine assembly returned to deliberation, and then, gradually, the Igigi receded from the centre of the narrative. The tablets grow quieter about them. After the creation of humanity in the Atrahasis epic, the focus shifts. Attention moves toward human multiplication, divine irritation, and eventually the flood. The Igigi, once the central agents of crisis, become part of the broader heavenly host. Their specific identity as labourers dissolves into general references to gods. This silence is significant. Myths often linger on those who are punished or exalted. The Igigi receive neither prolonged condemnation nor special honour. They are simply no longer required to dig canals. Their rebellion succeeded in relieving them of toil, and the story moves on. In some later Mesopotamian texts, the term Igigi appears in lists of divine beings dwelling in heaven. It functions as a collective designation rather than a description of labour status. In those contexts, the earlier memory of burden fades. The shift suggests that their role transformed quietly. They were not expelled from the divine realm. They were not reduced in rank. They resumed participation in the heavenly assembly without the yoke of manual labour. The absence of dramatic aftermath distinguishes their story from many later traditions of rebellion. There is no exile to darkness, no eternal confinement beneath mountains, no cosmic scar marking their defiance. Instead, there is administrative adjustment followed by narrative silence. This silence may reflect Scribal priorities. Once humanity assumes the workload, the Igigi no longer drive the plot. The myth's focus turns to the relationship between gods and humans, yet the silence also invites speculation. Did the Igigi remain unified after their relief? Did solidarity forged through 40 years of shared toil persist in times of ease? The tablets do not say. Their collective identity as labourers had bound them. Freed from that common burden, they likely reintegrated into the broader divine structure. In Mesopotamian cosmology, divine assemblies include numerous unnamed gods. The Igigi could easily blend into that multitude. Their earlier protest does not seem to carry stigma. The Anunnaki's fear led to adaptation, not resentment recorded in the texts. The silence may therefore signal resolution rather than erasure. The storm of rebellion passed, the world stabilized, the narrative advanced to new tensions. When humanity grows numerous and loud, the crisis centers on mortals rather than divine workers. The Igigi are not depicted as participating in suppression of humans. They fade into the background. This fading raises an important question about mythic memory. Stories emphasize conflict and transformation. Once transformation is achieved, characters tied to the conflict often recede. The Igigi had fulfilled their narrative function. They exposed imbalance and triggered creation. After that, their continued presence was less dramatic. Some later traditions may have absorbed their memory into other categories of divine beings. The fluidity of ancient terminology allowed for such blending. The distinction between Anunnaki and Igigi in early texts becomes less pronounced in later ones. Over centuries, the memory of labour and rebellion may have softened into general references to heavenly hosts. Silence in ancient texts does not always indicate absence, it can indicate normalization. The Igigi, once rebels, became ordinary members of the divine order. Their silence also contrasts with the loudness attributed to humanity later. Humans multiply and create noise that disturbs Enlil. The Igigi's rebellion was loud enough to cause fear, but afterward they are quiet. Perhaps that quiet reflects satisfaction. They no longer bore the yoke. The canals continued to function under mortal supervision. The divine hierarchy remained intact. In that stability, the Igigi's role became less urgent. The absence of punishment narratives may also reflect the Mesopotamian emphasis on practical resolution. The problem was labour distribution. Once redistributed, the problem ceased. There was no need for moral reckoning. The silence after the storm suggests that rebellion was not identity-defining in perpetuity. It was an event. The Igigi were not eternally marked as rebels. They were gods who had objected to excessive burden and had been accommodated. This portrayal offers a rare model of conflict resolution within myth. The system adjusted. The participants resumed their roles. The narrative progressed. Over time, human civilizations would rise and fall along the very rivers once dug by divine hands. Scribes would inscribe clay tablets recounting the flood, the deeds of kings, the epics of heroes. The Igigi's name would appear occasionally, often without elaboration. The memory of their toil lingered in the background of creation stories. Their silence is also instructive for understanding how myths evolve. Not every dramatic episode receives extended aftermath. Sometimes, transformation is sufficient. The Igigi's rebellion was necessary to explain humanity's origin in this narrative. Once that explanation was established, their continued story became secondary. Yet the echo of their action remains embedded in the structure of the myth. Human labour exists because divine labour once ceased. The silence after the storm does not erase that fact. It simply reflects that the cosmos, having adjusted, continued forward. The Igigi returned to the ranks of the heavenly host, no longer defined by baskets of earth or decades of digging. Their tools were ash, their burden transferred. The storm had passed, and in the quiet that followed, the world turned under mortal hands while the former divine workers watched from above, integrated once more into the order they had helped reshape. The rebellion of the Igigi appears at first as a singular event. A group of younger gods grows tired of labour, gathers at night, surrounds Enlil's dwelling, and forces a structural change in the cosmos. Humanity is created. Order resumes. The narrative moves forward. Yet when placed within the broader landscape of Mesopotamian mythology, the episode begins to resemble part of a pattern, rather than an isolated disturbance. Divine order in these texts is rarely static. It is negotiated, challenged, and reshaped repeatedly. The Igigi's uprising becomes the first clear articulation of this dynamic. Strain accumulates, authority trembles, adaptation follows. In the Enemy Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, an earlier cosmic conflict unfolds. Tiamat, embodiment of primordial waters, rises against the younger gods. Marduk defeats her and fashions the world from her body. Order is established through conflict. That narrative predates or overlaps with the Atrahasis tradition in certain layers of cultural memory. In both cases, upheaval precedes reconfiguration. The Igigi's rebellion differs in tone from the battle against Tiamat. It is not violent combat, it is collective refusal, yet the structural function is similar. Crisis exposes imbalance, resolution reshapes hierarchy. Even within the Atrahasis epic itself, cycles of strain recur. After humanity is created, population growth generates new tension. Enlil sends plagues, droughts, and eventually the flood. Each crisis prompts divine deliberation. Each resolution alters the parameters of existence. Rebellion, disturbance, and corrective adaptation form a repeating sequence. The Igigi were not the first beings in Mesopotamian myth to disrupt order, nor would they be the last. What makes their story distinctive is its administrative tone. The upheaval is not framed as cosmic chaos threatening annihilation. It is framed as a labour dispute with cosmic consequences. This practical framing underscores a deeper pattern. Order in Mesopotamian cosmology is maintained through continual adjustment. The gods themselves are subject to strain and recalibration. The idea of divine upheaval reflects the lived experience of Mesopotamian societies. Rivers flooded unpredictably. Droughts struck without warning. Cities rose and fell. Kings gained power and were overthrown. Stability was fragile. Myth mirrored that fragility. The Igigi's rebellion reveals that even divine hierarchies are not immune to systemic stress. Authority can be questioned. Burden can become unsustainable. The system must respond or fracture. This pattern reappears in later narratives where individual gods challenge one another. Inanna descends into the underworld, disrupting cosmic balance. Enki intervenes to restore her. Tensions emerge between deities over cities, patronage, and influence. Each conflict ends not with permanent rupture, but with re-established equilibrium. The cycle is familiar. Tension, confrontation, adjustment, continuity. The Igigi's uprising fits neatly into this rhythm. It also establishes a precedent within the mythic imagination. If lower-ranking divine beings can force structural change, then hierarchy is not absolute. It is negotiated. That precedent echoes subtly in later human narratives of kingship. Mesopotamian kings were expected to maintain justice and balance. If they failed, rebellion could arise. The divine model of adjustment legitimized human expectations of accountability. The Igigi's story demonstrates that endurance has limits, even among immortals. The Anunnaki's trembling underscores that authority must remain responsive. Divine upheaval is therefore not aberration but mechanism. The flood narrative reinforces this. Humanity becomes too numerous. Enlil responds with destruction. Enki intervenes to preserve a remnant. Post-flood measures limit human fertility and lifespan. The system recalibrates. Cycles of upheaval and reform continue. In later Babylonian theology, Marduk rises to supremacy after defeating Tiamat. The pantheon reorganizes around his authority. Power shifts, order redefined. The Mesopotamian cosmos is not static monarchy. It is dynamic governance. The Igigi's rebellion exemplifies this dynamism without descending into cosmic warfare. It suggests that upheaval need not result in annihilation. It can result in redistribution. That theme resonates beyond Mesopotamia. In many ancient cultures, myths record conflicts among gods that lead to new orders. Greek mythology recounts the Titanomachy and the rise of the Olympians. Norse mythology describes wars between Aesir and Vanir. Each upheaval reshapes divine hierarchy. The Igigi's rebellion stands apart in its focus on labour rather than dominion. Yet the underlying pattern is shared. Tension within divine systems triggers transformation. This cycle may reflect human understanding of governance. No structure remains perfectly balanced indefinitely. Strain accumulates. Reform follows crisis. The divine realm in Mesopotamian myth mirrors that reality. The Igigi's collective action shows that change can emerge from those beneath rather than solely from those above. This introduces a subtle democratizing element within an otherwise hierarchical cosmos. It also foreshadows later human patterns. Labourers revolt, kings negotiate, systems evolve. The divine upheaval becomes template for human history. The Atrahasis epic does not explicitly draw that parallel, but the resonance would have been evident to ancient audiences. The canals dug by the Igigi became canals maintained by humans. The pattern of burden and protest could repeat among mortals. Cycles of divine upheaval thus reflect and inform cycles of human experience. The rebellion is not an isolated rupture. It is first iteration of a recurring theme. The Anunnaki tremble, they deliberate, they adapt. Humanity later multiplies. Enlil reacts. Enki intervenes. Measures are imposed. Each upheaval ends not with total destruction, but with modified order. The pattern suggests that stability is never final. The Igigi's refusal opened the door to creation. The flood narrowed human lifespan. Later myths would continue to record shifts in divine authority and cosmic balance. Rebellion, within this framework, is not synonymous with evil. It is catalyst. The cosmos in Mesopotamian imagination breathes through cycles of tension and resolution. The Igigi's story marks the first clear articulation of that rhythm. 40 years of toil led to collective action. Collective action led to innovation. Innovation led to new equilibrium. And as future generations of scribes pressed these stories into clay, they preserved not only the memory of divine labourers who refused to dig, but the deeper recognition that even heaven is subject to cycles of strain and renewal. The tablets fall quiet after the creation of humanity. The canals are reassigned. The flood comes and recedes. Kings rise and inscribe their names into clay. The Igigi remain in the background, no longer digging, no longer encircling gates. Yet a question lingers beneath the silence of the texts. If they refused once, what prevented refusal from happening again? The Atrahasis epic does not record a second uprising among the Igigi. It does not describe renewed tension between them and the Anunnaki after humanity assumes the burden of labour. The crisis appears resolved. The system stabilizes. The narrative moves forward. Still, the first rebellion established precedent. Precedent matters in myth as much as in law. Once a boundary has been crossed, it exists in memory. The Igigi demonstrated that hierarchy is not immovable. They revealed that collective action can force structural change. That knowledge cannot be undone. In the aftermath of their relief, the Divine Assembly reorganized itself around a new arrangement. The Anunnaki ruled. Humanity laboured. The Igigi resumed participation in the heavenly host without physical burden. Perhaps that redistribution removed the immediate cause for dissent. The Igigi no longer bore the yoke. Their grievance had been addressed. Yet the infusion of divine blood into humanity introduced a new variable. Human beings, carrying the intelligence of the sacrificed God, would one day question their own burdens. They would build cities. They would organize labour. They would challenge kings. The pattern established in heaven could echo on earth. The Igigi's refusal thus becomes template rather than isolated incident. The tablets do not suggest that the Igigi were under surveillance or threat after the rebellion. There is no narrative of punishment or suspicion lingering over them. The Anunnaki's trembling gave way to adaptation, not repression. This lack of retribution implies restored trust, at least functionally. But restored trust does not erase the memory of vulnerability. The senior gods had learned that their authority depended on cooperation. The Igigi had learned that collective unity holds power. These lessons endure even if unspoken. In Mesopotamian myth, divine assemblies continue to deliberate and sometimes disagree. Inanna defies expectations. Enki subverts Enlil's severity. Marduk ascends to supremacy after contest. Conflict among gods remains possible. The Igigi's earlier rebellion fits within that broader pattern of tension among divine ranks. If new imbalance emerged, if the Igigi were assigned burdens once more beyond tolerance, the precedent suggests they could respond again. The absence of recorded second rebellion does not guarantee impossibility. It suggests sufficiency of the solution at that moment. Humanity's role as labourer may have created buffer large enough to prevent renewed divine strain. The canals were maintained, offerings were brought to temples, the gods received sustenance without manual toil. The structural issue that triggered the first uprising had been resolved. Still, the broader mythic landscape reveals that divine stability remains conditional. When humanity's noise disturbs Enlil, the solution is not negotiation, but near annihilation by flood. The gods respond differently to mortal strain than they did to divine strain. The Igigi were part of the divine community. Humans were not. That distinction may explain why a second divine refusal does not occur within recorded myth. The Igigi's status within the heavenly host grants them influence. Humanity's status as created labourers limits theirs, yet humanity carries divine intelligence. Over time, human kings claim semi-divine status. Temples rise in ziggurat form, bridging heaven and earth. Rituals aim to secure divine favour. The boundary between divine and human realms becomes layered. In such a world, the idea of refusal, of challenging imposed burden, does not disappear. It migrates. The silence regarding renewed Igigi rebellion may reflect confidence in the new arrangement. It may also reflect narrative economy. The story had achieved its explanatory purpose. The myth was not concerned with documenting every potential crisis. It recorded those that reshaped existence. The Igigi's refusal reshaped existence. A second refusal might not have done so dramatically. Still, the possibility lingers conceptually. The first rebellion demonstrated that immortality does not equal infinite compliance. It also demonstrated that authority can adapt rather than destroy. Those two truths form a quiet undercurrent in Mesopotamian cosmology. The gods are powerful but not immune to strain. Systems can fracture. Solutions can be creative. If the Igigi were ever to face renewed imbalance, the memory of their earlier success would remain part of their collective identity. The tablets do not give them a concluding speech. They do not proclaim eternal satisfaction. They simply fade back into the divine order. Perhaps that fading signals integration. The conflict resolved. Their unity no longer required visible assertion. Or perhaps the silence serves as a reminder that upheaval need not repeat when balance is maintained. The world created in response to their refusal functioned for generations within mythic time. Human labour sustained canals. Offering sustained gods. The Igigi's burden did not return. Yet the deeper pattern remains clear. Rebellion, once enacted, becomes part of the cosmic vocabulary. It shows that hierarchy is dynamic. It reveals that endurance has limits. It demonstrates that collective voice can alter structure. Whether or not the Igigi ever refused again within the mythic timeline, their initial defiance carved possibility into the fabric of divine order. And that possibility does not vanish simply because the story grows quiet, for it remains embedded in the memory of heaven and earth alike, waiting should imbalance once again press heavily upon those beneath the throne. The canals are quiet now in the telling. The siege at Enlil's gate has long since passed into memory. The clay has dried. The blood has settled into mortal veins. Humanity walks the earth carrying baskets once lifted by gods. The Igigi stand again among the heavenly host, no longer bent beneath the weight of soil. When we step back from the sequence of events, something becomes clear. The rebellion of the Igigi did not destroy the cosmos. It did not topple the Anunnaki. It did not plunge heaven into permanent chaos. It created something. That distinction matters. In many later traditions, rebellion is framed as rupture that leads only to punishment. Here, rebellion leads to transformation. The divine order shifts. Labour is redistributed. A new species enters existence. The Igigi did not set out to invent humanity. They set out to end their burden. Yet their refusal opened space for creation. Rebellion, in this myth, functions as catalyst rather than catastrophe. The Anunnaki trembled. They feared collapse. Instead, they adapted. Enki proposed an alternative. Clay and blood became flesh. The world continued under new arrangement. The narrative does not celebrate rebellion as virtue. It does not condemn it as evil. It presents it as a response to imbalance. What rebellion created was not freedom for all. It created transfer of responsibility. Humanity inherited the workload. This transfer is sobering. The Igigi laid down their tools. Humans picked them up. The burden did not vanish. It moved. There is something honest in that movement. The myth does not promise elimination of toil. It acknowledges that labour sustains order. Someone must dig the canals. Someone must carry the baskets. What changes is who. Rebellion reveals the limits of endurance. It forces recognition. It demands adaptation. The Igigi's act demonstrates that even within divine hierarchy, pressure accumulates. When the threshold is crossed, systems must respond. Human history reflects similar patterns. Empires rise on labour. Labourers endure. At times they refuse. Structures shift. New arrangements form. The work rarely disappears. It changes hands. The Mesopotamian scribes who pressed these stories into clay lived in societies dependent on irrigation and collective effort. They understood burden intimately. They also understood that without cooperation, cities failed. The Igigi's story carries that awareness into the heavens. Rebellion created humanity, but it also created interdependence between gods and mortals. Before the uprising, the Anunnaki relied on the Igigi. Afterward, they relied on humans for labour and offerings. Dependence did not vanish. It multiplied. Humanity, infused with divine intelligence, would eventually question its own burdens. The pattern seeded in heaven would echo on earth. Rebellion then creates awareness. It exposes reliance. It reveals imbalance. It prompts innovation. The Igigi's defiance did not seek to dismantle order. It sought to make order sustainable. Enki's solution demonstrates that authority can respond creatively rather than destructively. The flood that follows later in Accumulation shows that not all divine responses are adaptive in the same way. Enlil chooses annihilation. Enki chooses preservation. The cycle continues. Yet the first rebellion stands apart for its constructive outcome. Clay and blood stand as testament to that outcome. The quiet thought that emerges from this story is not about glorifying defiance or condemning obedience. It is about understanding that systems, whether divine or human, require balance. When balance tilts too far, something gives. In this myth, what gave was not the cosmos, but the assignment of labour. The Igigi no longer dig. Humans do. The rivers still flow. The world continues. Rebellion created a bridge between heaven and earth. It created beings capable of thought and work. It created a new layer in the hierarchy. It created possibility. As night settles in the telling, the Igigi's march feels distant, yet its consequences remain immediate. Every field cultivated, every canal maintained in ancient Mesopotamia carried the echo of that earlier refusal. The gods adapted, the world adjusted, creation followed conflict. And in that pattern lies a simple recognition. Rebellion does not always end in ruin. Sometimes it reshapes the world quietly, redistributing weight, altering relationships, and leaving behind a new arrangement that carries forward into generations unseen. The story does not close with triumph or tragedy. It rests with transformation. The Igigi's burden ended. Humanity's began. The heavens steadied. And somewhere between clay and blood, refusal and creation, the world found a different way to endure.